Boring history for sleep. How to survive a Roman gladiator's worst day. The first rays of sunlight had not yet pierced the small barred window of the underground cell when Lucius awoke, his body tensed against the damp cold of the stone floor. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind, a merciful fog that briefly concealed the truth of his circumstances. But reality, like the persistent drip of water from the ceiling to the puddle beside his thin, sleeping mat, gradually reasserted itself. Today was the day, his first day in the arena. Lucius had been in the Ludus for 3 months now, though it felt like years had passed since he'd been torn from his village in Gaul, marched across territories in chains, and finally sold at auction in Rome. The memory of his sister's face still haunted him, her desperate plea as the slave traders dragged him away. "Live, Lucius. Promise me you'll live." A promise easier made than kept, especially today. The Ludus Caius Balbus operated was not among the prestigious training grounds that produced the celebrated gladiators, whose names echoed through the streets of Rome. It was a second-rate establishment that churned out cannon fodder for the games. Men expected to die spectacularly for the entertainment of the crowd. What training Lucius had received was rudimentary at best, just enough to ensure he wouldn't embarrass himself too quickly in the arena. Balbus invested only in those slaves who showed exceptional natural talent. The rest, like Lucius, were expendable assets, their deaths calculated as acceptable losses in the Lannister's ledgers. The sound of the guard's keys rattling against the iron door broke through Lucius's thoughts. The door swung open with a familiar creak, and the gruff voice of Attius, the most senior of the guards, filled the small space. "Up, Gaul! Today's your day to die gloriously for Rome." Lucius rose silently. His tall frame stooped slightly beneath the low ceiling. At 24 years of age, he was neither young enough to inspire the crowd's sympathy nor old enough to command their respect. His lean body bore the marks of hard labor from his former life as a farmer. Useful muscles, but not the sculpted physique of a professional fighter. What set him apart, what had kept him alive these past months, was not physical prowess, but a quiet intelligence that burned behind his grey eyes. The Lannister wants all new men in the courtyard. Now, Attius added, thumping his vine staff against the wall for emphasis. Lucius followed the guard through the dimly lit corridor, passing cells identical to his own. Some contained sleeping men, others were empty, their former occupants either promoted to better quarters after proving their worth or carried out to unmarked graves after failing to do so. The smells of the Ludus assaulted his nostrils, human waste, sweat, blood, and the peculiar metallic odor of fear that seemed to permeate the walls themselves. The courtyard was a rectangular space open to the sky, surrounded by the cells and training areas of the Ludus. Dawn was just breaking, casting long shadows across the packed dirt ground. About 24 men were already assembled, standing in loose formation. Lucius recognized some, fellow novices who had arrived around the same time as he had. Their faces reflected what he imagined his own must show, a mixture of resignation and barely contained terror. Caius Balbus appeared on the balcony overlooking the courtyard, a cup of wine already in his hand despite the early hour. The Lannister was a heavy-set man with a prosperous belly that strained against his expensive tunic. His face, flushed from years of excess, bore the perpetual expression of a man calculating profits and losses. "Today," Balbus announced without preamble, 12 of you will fight in the games, the morning matches, of course." He took a long swallow of wine. "No one expects much from you. You're the appetizer before the main course. But remember, impress the crowd, and you might survive. Bore them, and I'll make sure you don't return, even if you somehow manage to win." His eyes swept over the assembled men with the dispassionate assessment of a butcher eyeing livestock. "Attius will give you your assignments. Some of you will fight beasts, others will face each other. The weapons master will issue equipment based on your designated roles." A thin smile crossed his face. "Make me proud, or at least make me money." With that, he turned and disappeared back into his private quarters, leaving the men to contemplate their fates. Attius stepped forward with a wax tablet, calling out names and assignments. Lucius felt his stomach tighten as he waited. "Lucius the Gaul," Attius finally called out. "Sword and shield. You'll fight against Nero the Numidian in the third match." Sword and shield, the equipment of a mumio, one of the most common types of gladiators. Neither the most prestigious nor the most despised role, but one that would put him directly against another man in single combat. The prospect of killing another slave, another man forced into this life just as he had been, sat like a stone in Lucius's gut. Yet the alternative, to die himself, pulled at the promise he had made to his sister. As the men dispersed to prepare, a hand fell on Lucius's shoulder. He turned to find himself face to face with Cassius, a veteran gladiator who had survived more than a dozen fights over 3 years. His heavily scarred face bore witness to his experiences, but it was his eyes that commanded attention, cold, assessing, and utterly devoid of the fear that plagued the novices. "You're the Gaul who thinks too much," Cassius said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. "I'm Lucius," he replied, unsure what else to say. "I've watched you in training. You're not strong enough or fast enough to survive on skill alone." Cassius's blunt assessment stung, though Lucius knew it to be true. "But you watch. You notice things. That might keep you alive today." "Why are you telling me this?" Lucius asked, suspicious of unexpected kindness in a place where self-interest was the only reliable currency. Cassius's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "I wagered on you to survive your first fight. Don't make me lose my money." With that cryptic explanation, he walked away, leaving Lucius to wonder whether to feel encouraged or manipulated. Before he could decide, Attius shouted for the new fighters to report to the armory for equipment fitting and final preparations. The armory was a long, low building adjacent to the main training ground. Inside, weapon racks lined the walls, holding an assortment of swords, tridents, nets, and other implements of combat. The smell of oil, leather, and metal permeated the air. The weapons master, a wiry Greek named Demetrius, supervised as assistants, began distributing equipment to the fighters according to their assigned roles. "Mamilo!" Demetrius called out, and Lucius stepped forward along with 2 other men. The assistant handed him a gladius, shorter than the legionary sword, but well balanced for close combat, and a rectangular shield that covered much of his body. The helmet came next, a heavy bronze affair with a wide brim and a stylized fish crest on top, with small eye holes and a grill that would cover his face during combat. The weight of it all was considerable, and Lucius knew that fatigue would become a deadly enemy in the arena almost as quickly as his opponent. As he adjusted the straps of his armor, a small figure appeared at his side, Flavia, one of the slaves who served as healers in the Ludus. Her dark eyes were set in a face that might once have been beautiful before hardship etched its permanent lines. She carried a small clay pot of what appeared to be some kind of salve. "For your joints," she said quietly, dipping her fingers into the pungent mixture and applying it to his wrists and elbows. "It will help with flexibility and pain." "Thank you," Lucius murmured, surprised by the gesture. Flavia rarely spoke to the gladiators unless she was tending their wounds after training. "You're different from most of them," she said, her eyes darting to ensure no one was listening too closely. "You still see people as people. Is that a weakness here?" he asked. Her fingers paused in their work. "It might keep you human. Whether it keeps you alive..." She left the thought unfinished as she moved to his ankles, applying the salve with efficient movements. "What do you know about the Numidian?" Lucius asked, taking advantage of her apparent willingness to talk. Flavia's expression grew guarded. "He's been here longer than you. 5 fights, 3 victories. Quick with his attack, but impatient." She hesitated, then added, "He tires in his right arm. Watch for it after the first few exchanges." Lucius nodded his thanks, recognizing the risk she took in providing such information. In the world of the Ludus, such details could be the difference between life and death, and sharing them was not without consequence if discovered. "The gods favor those who favor themselves," she said cryptically as she finished and moved away to attend to another fighter. The morning progressed with agonizing slowness. After equipment fitting came the ritual meal, a bland but protein-rich mixture of barley, beans and dried meat, designed to provide energy without sitting too heavily in the stomach. The men ate in near silence, each lost in private thoughts or prayers. Some boasted loudly of the glory they would achieve, but Lucius recognized it as fear disguised as bravado. Others vomited in corners, their nerves getting the better of them. By mid-morning, they were loaded into covered carts for the journey to the amphitheater. Rome's Grand Colosseum was still under construction, but the city boasted several smaller venues where games were held regularly. Today's fights would take place in the Forum Boreum, an older amphitheater near the cattle market that hosted second-tier games, appropriate for untested fighters like Lucius and his comrades. The journey through Rome's crowded streets offered brief glimpses of a world that seemed increasingly foreign to Lucius. Ordinary citizens went about their business. Merchants hawked their wares, children played in alleys, women carried water from public fountains. Lives untouched by the brutal reality that awaited him, the normality of it all seemed like a cruel taunt. The carts finally arrived at the back entrance to the amphitheater, where guards ushered the gladiators into the hypogeum, the underground area beneath the arena where fighters and beasts were kept before their appearances. The space was chaotic, filled with nervous energy as fighters prepared. Handlers controlled agitated animals in cages, and officials shouted orders. The air was thick with dust, sweat, and the distinct odor of wild animals. A harried-looking official directed the new arrivals to a holding area designated for Balbus's men. They joined several other gladiators from different ludi who would be participating in the day's events. From above, they could hear the muffled roar of the gathering crowd, punctuated by occasional trumpet blasts that signaled the beginning of the ceremonies. "Listen up!" Attius called out to Balbus's fighters. "The procession begins in 1 hour. Before that, the Lanista wants to inspect you himself." Caius Balbus arrived shortly thereafter, now dressed in an immaculate toga that emphasized his status. He walked slowly along the line of his gladiators, making adjustments to their equipment, barking criticisms, occasionally offering a word of encouragement when it suited him. When he reached Lucius, he paused. "Ah, the Gaul who doesn't speak much," Balbus said, his breath heavy with the scent of wine and garlic. "Remember what I told you about boring the crowd?" He leaned closer. "I have 20 denarii I wagered on you to die today. Don't disappoint me by surviving without style." The casual cruelty of the statement was typical of Balbus, designed to unsettle and provoke. Lucius kept his face impassive, offering neither the satisfaction of fear nor the excuse of insolence. After a moment, Balbus moved on, evidently disappointed by the lack of reaction. As the hour drew nearer, a priest arrived to conduct the traditional pre-combat rituals. The gladiators were led in prayers to Jupiter for strength, to Mars for courage, and to Nemesis, the goddess of fate, for a worthy death if death was to be their lot today. Lucius went through the motions mechanically, his thoughts not on the Roman gods but on the old Gaulish deities of his childhood. Would Teutates, god of war and protection, watch over him today? Or would Cernunnos, lord of the wild, welcome him to the afterlife before the sun set? The sound of trumpets grew louder, and an official announced that the Pompa, the opening procession, would begin. The gladiators were arranged in order, with the most prestigious fighters at the front and the novices like Lucius bringing up the rear. They would parade around the arena, presenting themselves to the crowd before the day's events began. The massive wooden gates creaked open, and sunlight flooded the dim hypogeum. The first fighters stepped out to the roar of the crowd, and slowly the procession moved forward. When Lucius's turn came to emerge into the arena, the sensory assault was overwhelming. The brightness of the sun after the darkness below, the deafening noise of thousands of spectators, the vastness of the space. It momentarily disoriented him as he struggled to maintain formation with the others. The sand of the arena was pristine white, imported at great expense to provide a dramatic backdrop for the blood that would soon stain it. Around the oval space rose tier upon tier of seating, filled with Romans of various social classes, the wealthy and politically connected in the front rows, the common citizens above them, and at the very top, the poorest spectators and slaves who were permitted to attend. Colourful awnings provided shade for the privileged, while those in the upper tiers baked in the summer sun. As they completed their circuit of the arena, the gladiators assembled before the editor's box, where the official sponsor of the games sat with his honoured guests. Today's editor was a minor senator seeking to curry public favour, his expression betraying his calculation of whether the expense of the games would translate to sufficient political capital. "We who are about to die salute you," the gladiators called out in unison, raising their weapons in the traditional salute. The words caught in Lucius's throat, not from fear, but from the grim acknowledgement of their truth. Many of them, perhaps most, would not see the sunset. After the ceremony concluded, the fighters were led back to the hippodrome to await their turns. The day's events would begin with animal hunts, followed by executions of condemned criminals, and finally the gladiatorial combats. As a murmillo in the third match, Lucius would have hours to wait, each passing minute stretching his nerves tighter. He found a relatively quiet corner and sat with his back against the wall, helmet beside him, trying to control his breathing as his father had taught him long ago during hunting expeditions. "Fear makes you quick, but steals your clarity," his father had said. "Breathe until you find the space between fear and recklessness." First time? Lucius looked up to see an older gladiator he didn't recognize, a heavily muscled man with a network of scars across his chest and arms that spoke of years in the arena. "Yes," Lucius answered simply. The man nodded. "I'm Titus. 15 fights over 7 years. He gestured to the scars. Obviously not undefeated, but still breathing. "How?" The question escaped before Lucius could consider it. Titus gave a mirthless laugh. "Not by being the best fighter. There's always someone better." He tapped his temple. "By understanding what the crowd wants. Give them a show. Make them remember you. And sometimes they'll spare you even in defeat. And if they don't, then you die with dignity, which is more than most men get." Titus studied him for a moment. "Who are you fighting?" "Nero the Numidian." Titus's expression revealed nothing. "Fast. Likes to finish quickly. Prone to showboating if he thinks he has the upper hand." He rose to his feet. "Don't let him dictate the pace. Make him work for it." With that cryptic advice, he wandered away, leaving Lucius to his thoughts once more. From above came the sounds of the beast fights. Roars, screams, and the crowd's reactions telling a story that Lucius could only partially decipher. He tried not to think about the men who had gone up before him, whether they now lay bleeding into the sand or stood victorious. Time crawled by until finally an official approached. "Murmiones, prepare yourselves. You're after the next execution." Lucius rose, his limbs feeling simultaneously leaden and disconnected from his body. He donned his helmet, adjusted his armor one final time, and took up his shield and sword. Nearby, he caught sight of his opponent. Nero the Numidian was indeed preparing as well. The man was shorter than Lucius, but more powerfully built, with the confident movements of someone who had done this before and expected to prevail again. Their eyes met briefly across the chamber. Nero offered a small nod, not friendly but acknowledging. They were not enemies by choice but by circumstance, both pawns in a game neither had asked to play. There was a certain cold comfort in that shared understanding. The executions must have concluded, for the official returned, gesturing for Lucius and Nero to approach the gates. "Remember," he said, "the crowd is here for entertainment. Give them what they want, and you might leave alive." The gates opened once more, and Lucius stepped out into the arena for the second time that day, no longer as part of a procession, but as a participant in life and death. The announcer's voice boomed across the space, introducing the fighters with embellished descriptions designed to spark interest. Nero the Numidian, victor of 3 contests, the desert whirlwind of death. Cheers and some jeers greeted this introduction. Nero had his supporters and detractors among the regular attendees. And facing him, in his first appearance in our arena, Lucius of Gaul, the Northern Mystery. The crowd's response was more muted. Curiosity rather than excitement for an untested fighter. Lucius barely registered it, his focus narrowing to the man approaching from the opposite side of the arena. They circled slowly toward the center, where the referee waited to begin the contest. The referee, a former gladiator himself, gave them the usual warnings against dishonorable tactics, then stepped back and signaled for the fight to begin. The crowd hushed momentarily, then resumed its roar as the 2 men began to circle each other. Nero made the first move, a quick thrust designed to test Lucius's reflexes rather than to wound. Lucius blocked it with his shield, the impact reverberating up his arm. Another thrust followed and another, each coming faster and with more commitment behind it. Nero was establishing dominance, pushing Lucius back with the sheer aggression of his attack. Lucius remembered Flavia's words, quick with his attack, but impatient. He continued to give ground deliberately, letting Nero expend energy while looking for patterns in his assault. The crowd began to grow restless, some shouting for Lucius to fight back, others calling for more blood. Nero, perhaps sensing the crowd's mood, increased the ferocity of his attacks. "Fight back, Gaul," he hissed through his helmet, "or die without honor." Lucius saw his opening when Nero overextended slightly on a thrust. He deflected the blade with his shield and stepped in, delivering a quick slash that caught Nero across the thigh. Not deep enough to cripple, but enough to draw first blood. The crowd roared its approval as crimson stained the white sand. Nero retreated a step, reassessing. "Not completely useless, then," he muttered, circling again. The dynamic of the fight shifted. Nero became more cautious, his attacks more measured. Lucius began to find his rhythm, the training of the past months coming to life in the desperate reality of combat. They exchanged blows, neither gaining a clear advantage, both collecting minor wounds that painted their bodies with streaks of red. The summer heat beat down mercilessly, and Lucius could feel fatigue setting in. His shield arm grew heavier with each block, his breathing more labored inside the confining helmet. Across from him, Nero also showed signs of tiring, his movements losing some of their initial crispness. As Flavia had predicted, his right arm, his sword arm, seemed to be troubling him particularly. Seizing the moment, Lucius launched his own attack, driving Nero back with a series of controlled blows. The crowd, appreciating the shift in momentum, cheered him on. For a brief, surreal moment, Lucius felt almost disconnected from himself, as though watching the fight from above. 2 men locked in mortal combat for the entertainment of thousands who cared nothing for them as people. The moment of philosophical detachment cost him. Nero, despite his fatigue, saw an opening and struck with surprising speed. His blade slipped past Lucius's guard and bit into his side, finding the gap between pieces of armor. White-hot pain exploded through Lucius's body, driving him to one knee. The crowd erupted, sensing the imminent conclusion to the contest. Nero pressed his advantage, raining blows that Lucius could barely deflect with his shield. Each impact drove him further down, and he found himself on his back, shield raised desperately above him as Nero stood over him, sword poised for the killing stroke. "Yield," Nero said, his voice low enough that only Lucius could hear. "Maybe they'll grant mercy." In that moment, time seemed to slow for Lucius. He saw the arena around him, the faces of the spectators blending into a single, hungry entity, demanding blood and resolution. He saw Nero above him, a man forced into this position just as he had been, both of them stripped of choice and dignity. He saw his sister's face, heard her plea. "Live, Lucius. Promise me you'll live." With a surge of will that surprised even himself, Lucius rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding Nero's descending blade. The sword struck sand, and before Nero could recover, Lucius swept his legs out from under him. Both men scrambled to their feet, but Lucius was faster, adrenaline temporarily overwhelming pain and fatigue. Now it was Nero on the defensive, backing away from Lucius's renewed assault. The crowd, appreciating the dramatic reversal, roared its approval. Lucius pressed his advantage, his sword finding gaps in Nero's defense, opening small wounds that gradually sapped the Numidian's strength. Finally, with a move that seemed born more of desperation than skill, Lucius knocked Nero's sword from his grasp with a powerful blow to the man's increasingly weak right arm. Nero fell to his knees, disarmed and at Lucius's mercy. The arena fell silent as the referee stepped forward, looking to the editor's box for the decision. Nero, following tradition, raised his left hand with one finger extended, the request for missio, for mercy. Lucius stood over him, sword ready but not striking, his breath coming in painful gasps as blood from his wounded side stained the sand beneath him. The editor rose in his box, dramatically drawing out the moment as he gauged the crowd's mood. Thumbs extended horizontally around the arena, some turning up for mercy, others turning down for death. It seemed evenly split, with neither sentiment clearly prevailing. In such cases, the decision reverted to the editor himself. The senator's thumb remained horizontal for a long moment, then slowly turned upward. Mercy. Perhaps he calculated that sparing both fighters would make him appear magnanimous, or perhaps he simply recognized that both men had fought well enough to deserve another day. Relief washed over Lucius, followed immediately by a wave of pain as the adrenaline began to ebb. He stepped back, lowering his sword as the referee officially declared the contest concluded. The crowd offered scattered applause, not the thunderous approval of a death match, but acknowledgement of an acceptable showing from two fighters who had given them sufficient entertainment. Attendants rushed out to help both men from the arena as the announcer called for the next match. Lucius staggered through the gates back into the hippodrome, where he was immediately surrounded by Balbus's people. His helmet was removed, and Flavia appeared at his side, already examining the wound. "It's deep, but clean," she murmured as she applied pressure to slow the bleeding. "You'll live if infection doesn't set in." "You survived," Attius said, his tone suggesting he wasn't sure whether to be impressed or disappointed. Balbus lost his wager. "How unfortunate for him," Lucius replied dryly, wincing as Flavia began cleaning his wound. "He'll recoup his losses. You've proven yourself worth keeping alive, at least for now. That makes you a more valuable asset." Attius gestured to the attendants. "Get him back to the Ludus. The physician will see to him there." As they helped him toward the exit, Lucius caught sight of Nero being tended to by his own Ludus's healers. Their eyes met briefly, and Nero offered a small nod, this time with something that might have been respect. They had both survived their contest, but the reprieve was temporary. There would be other fights, other opponents, until eventually one of them would fall. Such was the life they now lived. The journey back to the Ludus passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. By the time they arrived, Lucius was barely conscious, the loss of blood and the aftermath of combat taking their toll. He was taken directly to the physician's chamber, where his wound was properly cleaned, stitched and bandaged. The physician, a Greek freedman named Stephanos, worked efficiently, but not unkindly. "You're fortunate," he commented as he finished the bandaging. "Another inch deeper and we wouldn't be having this conversation." He mixed a concoction of herbs in a small cup. "Drink this, for the pain and to help prevent fever." Lucius drank the bitter mixture without complaint, then was helped to a recovery chamber, a small room separate from the regular cells, reserved for injured fighters whom the Lanista considered worth healing. Another sign that his status had changed, however slightly. He drifted in and out of consciousness as the day waned. Voices and footsteps passed outside his door, but he paid them little mind, lost in the strange liminal space between waking and dreaming. When he finally emerged fully into consciousness, night had fallen, and a single oil lamp cast weak light across the chamber. A figure sat beside his bed, Cassius, the veteran gladiator who had spoken to him that morning a lifetime ago. "You lived," Cassius said simply. "You won your wager," Lucius replied, his voice hoarse. A ghost of a smile crossed Cassius's scarred face. "I did, but that's not why I'm here." He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "You've crossed a threshold today, Gaul. You're no longer just a body waiting to die in the arena. You've become a gladiator. Is that supposed to be a compliment? It's a fact, one with consequences." Cassius's expression grew serious. "Balbus will invest more in your training now. You'll be given better food, better quarters, and harder opponents next time. So I've earned the right to die more impressively." Cassius laughed, a short, harsh sound, with little mirth in it. "Now you understand." He stood, preparing to leave. "Rest. We begin real training once your wound heals. Balbus has assigned me to work with you. Apparently he sees potential profit in keeping you alive a bit longer." Cassius moved to the door, then paused. "One more thing. The way you fought today, calculating, patient, that will serve you well. But don't forget the crowd. They decide whether you live or die as much as your opponent does." After Cassius left, Lucius lay awake despite his exhaustion, his mind replaying the events of the day. He had killed no one, had managed to survive without taking a life, but he harbored no illusions that such an outcome would always be possible. Sooner or later the editor's thumb would turn downward, and he would be faced with the choice to kill or be killed. The door opened again, more hesitantly this time. Flavia slipped in, carrying fresh bandages and another cup of medicinal tea. "I came to check your wound," she said, setting down her supplies. Fever often sets in during the night. She worked in silence for a few minutes, her touch gentle but efficient as she changed the bandage. Lucius noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the strain evident in her face. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for your help this morning." About his right arm. Flavia's hands stilled briefly. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course not," Lucius agreed, understanding her caution. Such information sharing could be punished severely if discovered. "But thank you all the same." She finished rebandaging his wound and handed him the cup. "Drink all of it. It will help you sleep." As he drank, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was a Gaul here before you. He lasted 2 years, 8 fights. She hesitated. "He was kind to me when others were not. What happened to him? What happens to all gladiators eventually?" Her expression closed off, the momentary vulnerability gone. "But before the end, he taught me something important. In this place, survival isn't just about strength or skill. It's about finding reasons to continue." "What's your reason?" Lucius asked, the medicine already making his thoughts fuzzy around the edges. Flavia gathered her supplies, her face unreadable in the dim light. "Hope," she said simply, "that one day I'll see the world beyond these walls again." She moved to the door. "Find your reason, Lucius of Gaul. You'll need it in the days to come." Sleep claimed him soon after she left, a deep, dreamless void that offered temporary escape from pain and the weight of his new reality. When he awoke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the small window of the recovery chamber. Another day, unexpected and uncertain. A new routine established itself in the weeks that followed. As Cassius had predicted, Lucius's status within the Ludus changed. He was moved to better quarters shared with other fighters who had proven their worth in the arena. His rations improved, with more meat and wine to build his strength. And once his wound healed sufficiently, the promised training with Cassius began. If Lucius had thought the previous month's training was difficult, Cassius's regimen proved that he had experienced only the barest introduction to the gladiator's craft. Day after day, from dawn until exhaustion claimed him, Lucius learned the true art of combat, not just how to swing a sword or block with a shield, but how to read an opponent's body, how to manage energy throughout a fight, how to play to the crowd while maintaining tactical awareness. Most men die in the arena, not because they're outmatched, Cassius explained during one particularly grueling session, but because they forget that they're fighting two battles simultaneously, one against their opponent and one for the crowd's favor. They trained with wooden practice swords in the main courtyard, surrounded by other pairs of fighters engaged in similar exercises. The summer heat was oppressive, and sweat poured down Lucius's body as he attempted to implement Cassius's instructions. Again, Cassius commanded after easily deflecting Lucius's attack, and this time, make it look impressive while maintaining your guard. Lucius attacked once more, adding a flourish that drew approving nods from some of the watching gladiators, but left his left side exposed. Cassius's practice blade rapped sharply against his ribs, eliciting a grunt of pain. "Dead," Cassius announced flatly. "The crowd would have loved your dramatic swing right up until the moment your entrails spilled onto the sand." He stepped back, resetting his stance. Balance gall, entertainment without suicide. They continued, and gradually, over days that stretched into weeks, Lucius began to find that balance. His body transformed, shedding the last vestiges of the farmer he had been, and assuming the honed physique of a professional fighter. Muscles hardened, reflexes sharpened, and skills that had once required conscious thought became instinctive. Throughout this transformation, Lucius found himself drawing closer to the small circle of people who now defined his world. Cassius remained stern and demanding as a trainer, but occasionally revealed glimpses of the man beneath the scarred exterior, a man who had once been a sailor from Alexandria before fate and misfortune delivered him to the Ludus. Flavia continued to tend to the fighter's injuries, her quiet competence a constant in the chaotic environment, and Lucius often found reasons to visit the infirmary even when his own health didn't require it. Other relationships formed as well. Titus, the veteran who had offered advice before Lucius's first fight, became a frequent companion during meals, sharing stories of his years in the arena with a mixture of pride and fatalism. And surprisingly, Lucius found himself developing something like camaraderie with some of the other gladiators, men who, like him, had not chosen this life, but were determined to survive it with whatever dignity they could maintain. Caius Balbus watched this evolution with the calculating eye of a businessman seeing an investment mature. He began to feature Lucius more prominently in the training demonstrations sometimes held for wealthy patrons who visited the Ludus seeking entertainment or considering sponsorship of fighters. During one such exhibition, Lucius caught the attention of a young patrician who commented favorably on his fighting style. "The Gaul has potential," the patrician remarked to Balbus. "He fights with his head, not just his muscles. Unusual in a barbarian." "Lucius is one of my most promising acquisitions," Balbus replied, his tone suggesting he had personally discovered and developed this rare talent, rather than purchased him as an untrained slave. "I have high hopes for his next appearance in the arena." That next appearance was approaching rapidly. 2 months after his first fight, Lucius was informed that he would participate in the upcoming games sponsored by a wealthy merchant celebrating his son's coming of age. This time, he would not be in the morning matches, but would fight in the afternoon, a sign of his elevated status and the higher expectations that came with it. "You'll be fighting a retiarius," Cassius informed him during their training session the following day. The retiarius was a type of gladiator armed with a net and trident, designed to entangle and then spear his opponent. "Antonius. He's good with the net, 3 wins, 1 loss. Any weaknesses?" Lucius asked, having learned the value of such intelligence. "He favors his right side for throws, and he gets frustrated when forced to fight defensively." Cassius demonstrated some techniques specifically designed to counter a net and trident fighter. Keep your distance until he's committed to a throw, then close quickly before he can recover his position. Indeed. As the day of the fight drew nearer, Lucius found himself less consumed by fear than he had been before his first match. Not because he underestimated the danger, if anything, he understood it more clearly now, but because he had begun to develop the professional fighter's ability to compartmentalize, to accept the risk as an inherent part of his existence. The night before the fight, he sat alone in the small shrine that the Ludus maintained for the gladiator's devotions. He had never been particularly religious, but the proximity of death had a way of focusing the mind on spiritual matters. He made small offerings to both the Roman gods that presided over this place and, more quietly, to the deities of his homeland. Seeking divine intervention, Lucius turned to find Flavia standing in the doorway, a small bundle in her hands. "Seeking whatever advantages I can find," he replied with a faint smile. She entered, setting the bundle beside him. "Herbs," she explained. "Burn them in your quarters tonight. They'll help you sleep and clear your lungs for tomorrow." "Thank you." He studied her face in the flickering lamplight. "Why do you help me?" Flavia was silent for a long moment. "Because you're still trying to hold on to something beyond survival," she finally said. "Most men in this place become nothing but animals eventually, fighting, rutting, existing. You're still fighting that transformation. And you? I was born a slave. I've never known anything else." Her voice held no self-pity, only statement of fact, but I've seen enough to know that there are different ways to live within chains. Some let bondage corrupt their souls. Others, she looked at him directly, others find ways to remain human despite everything. The intimacy of the moment hung between them, fragile and unexpected. Lucius found himself wanting to reach for her hand, but uncertain if such a gesture would be welcome. Before he could decide, footsteps sounded in the corridor outside, and Flavia quickly stepped away. "Rest well," she said, resuming the more formal tone of healer to patient. "You'll need your strength tomorrow." The following day unfolded with the now familiar rhythm of preparation. The ritual meal, the journey to the amphitheater, the waiting in the hypodrome as earlier matches proceeded above. This time, however, Lucius approached each step with the confidence of experience rather than the uncertainty of the novice. When his time came to enter the arena, he did so with measured strides, acknowledging the crowd's greeting with a raised sword as Cassius had taught him. Enough showmanship to engage their interest without appearing arrogant or overly theatrical. His opponent, Antonius the Retiarius, entered from the opposite side. He wore the distinctive equipment of his gladiator type, minimal armor to maximize mobility, no helmet, and the signature weapons of net and trident. His bare torso was deeply tanned and crossed with scars, his head shaved in the traditional style of the net fighter. They approached the center, where the referee waited. The same rituals, the same warnings, and then they were circling each other, each looking for the first opening. Antonius struck first, a quick thrust with the trident that Lucius easily deflected with his shield. It was a testing move, designed to gauge reactions rather than to wound. Lucius responded with a controlled advance, forcing Antonius to give ground while keeping his shield positioned to block any sudden net throw. They continued this dance for several minutes, neither gaining a significant advantage, each respecting the other's capabilities enough to avoid reckless aggression. The crowd grew restless, calling for more action. Antonius, perhaps feeling the pressure to entertain, attempted a dramatic net cast aimed at entangling Lucius's sword arm. Remembering Cassius's instruction, Lucius recognized the preparation for the throw and timed his move perfectly. As the net sailed through the air, he ducked beneath it and charged forward inside the reach of Antonius's trident. His gladius struck true, opening a long gash across the Retiarius's thigh. The crowd roared its approval as first blood was drawn. Antonius retreated, hampered by the wound and temporarily without his net, which lay on the sand several paces away. Lucius pressed his advantage, forcing the net fighter into a defensive posture, using his shield to block desperate trident thrusts. For a moment it seemed the fight might end quickly, but Antonius was a veteran who had survived previous defeats. He changed tactics, using the long reach of the trident to keep Lucius at bay while working his way back toward his net. The wound, while painful, had not struck any critical areas, and he moved with only slightly diminished speed. Lucius recognized the strategy and tried to prevent Antonius from recovering his net, but a well-timed thrust forced him to defend rather than attack. In that moment, Antonius managed to scoop up the net with his free hand, once again armed with his full complement of weapons. The dynamic of the fight shifted once more. Now it was Lucius giving ground, wary of being caught in the deadly combination of entanglement and spearing. Antonius, despite his injury, moved with renewed confidence, alternating threatening gestures with the net and actual casting attempts, keeping Lucius constantly on the defensive. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, and both men began to show signs of fatigue. Sweat stung Lucius's eyes inside his helmet, and his shield arm ached from the constant tension of readiness. Across from him, Antonius's movements had slowed slightly, and his wounded leg occasionally buckled when he put his full weight on it. In that moment of mutual exhaustion, Lucius remembered Flavia's words from the night before. Different ways to live within chains. Here in the arena, both he and Antonius were performing their assigned roles in a spectacle neither had chosen. Yet within those roles, within the confines of this deadly contest, there remained space for choice. Not about whether to fight, but about how to fight. With that thought crystallizing in his mind, Lucius made his decision. Rather than continuing the cautious exchange that might eventually lead to one of them making a fatal mistake through exhaustion, he would take a calculated risk. He deliberately lowered his guard slightly, creating what appeared to be an opening in his defense. Antonius, experienced fighter that he was, recognized the opportunity and committed to a powerful net throw aimed at Lucius's seemingly vulnerable position. But Lucius had anticipated this reaction. As the net flew toward him, he dropped to one knee, allowing it to pass over him, then launched himself forward in a rolling dive that brought him inside Antonius's reach before the retiarius could recover from the throw. Lucius's gladius struck upward, catching Antonius in the shoulder of his trident arm. The wound was deep enough to render the arm temporarily useless, and the trident fell from nerveless fingers. In an instant, the balance of power had shifted decisively. Antonius, now effectively disarmed, attempted to retreat, but his injured leg finally betrayed him. He stumbled and fell backward onto the sand. Lucius was on him immediately, sword at his throat, his foot on the retiarius's good arm to prevent any last desperate resistance. The referee stepped forward, signaling for the decision. Following tradition, Antonius raised his free hand with one finger extended, the request for mercy. The crowd's response was mixed, some calling for death, others for mercy, depending on their assessment of the entertainment value provided. The sponsor of the games, the merchant celebrating his son's coming of age, rose in his seat. The arena fell silent as he considered the fighters before him. After a dramatic pause, his thumb turned upward. Mercy. Perhaps influenced by the celebratory nature of the occasion, he chose to be magnanimous. Relief washed through Lucius as he stepped back, allowing attendants to help Antonius to his feet. Both men acknowledged the crowd's applause, then made their way back to the hypodium, supported by their respective ludus staff. In the underground chamber, Flavia was waiting with the other healers, immediately moving to examine Lucius's relatively minor injuries. "You fought well," she murmured as she cleaned a small cut on his arm, "and your opponent lives." "This time," Lucius replied, the moment of victory already giving way to the knowledge that there would be other fights, other opponents, and eventually, perhaps, a different outcome. "This time is all any of us have," she said, her fingers lingering briefly on his arm before she moved away to tend to other fighters. The return to the ludus was markedly different from his first post-fight journey. This time Lucius was conscious and alert, receiving congratulations from fellow gladiators and approving nods from the guards. Caius Balbus himself greeted them upon arrival, his face flushed with wine and the pleasure of profitable business. "Well done, Gaul," he said, clapping Lucius on the shoulder with forced camaraderie. "You've made me a tidy sum today. Keep this up, and you might actually earn your freedom someday." The mention of freedom, the remote possibility of manumission that was dangled before successful gladiators, struck Lucius with unexpected force. Until that moment, he had focused solely on survival, on fulfilling his promise to his sister to stay alive. The idea that he might one day regain his freedom, might see his homeland again, opened a door in his mind that he had kept firmly shut. That night, cleaned and tended, his muscles aching from exertion but his spirit buoyed by success, Lucius lay on his sleeping mat, contemplating this new perspective. Freedom was still a distant prospect. Gladiators typically needed to survive many fights and earn substantial purses before their owners considered releasing them, but it was no longer entirely beyond imagination. As sleep began to claim him, Lucius found himself thinking not just of survival, but of what might lie beyond it. For the first time since being brought to Rome in chains, he allowed himself to contemplate a future that extended past the next fight, the next day. It was a dangerous luxury in a place where death was always just one misstep away, but in that moment, it felt like a necessary act of defiance against the constraints of his existence. The weeks following his victory brought changes to Lucius's standing within the ludus. Balbus, recognizing his increasing value as an asset, invested more in his training and care. He was assigned his own small cell rather than shared quarters, a rare privilege that afforded a modicum of privacy. His training sessions with Cassius intensified, now supplemented with occasional instruction from specialized fighting masters brought in to refine particular aspects of his technique. "You're becoming something of a favorite," Cassius remarked during one such session. "Balbus has received inquiries about featuring you in more prominent games. Is that good or bad?" Lucius asked, retrieving his practice sword from where Cassius had knocked it from his grasp. "Both. Better treatment, higher stakes, more dangerous opponents." Cassius reset his stance, "and more attention from people who might prove useful or deadly, depending on their whims." One such person made his presence known shortly thereafter. Marcus Valerius Corvus, a wealthy equestrian with political ambitions, visited the ludus specifically to observe Lucius in training. He watched from the balcony overlooking the courtyard, deep in conversation with Balbus, occasionally pointing toward Lucius as the gladiator worked through combat drills. After the session concluded, Lucius was summoned to meet this potential patron. He presented himself as required, freshly bathed, but still bearing the minor bruises and scrapes of training. "So this is your Gallic sensation," Corvus said to Balbus, circling Lucius with the appraising eye of a man accustomed to evaluating merchandise. He was perhaps 40 years old, his toga expensively dyed, and his fingers adorned with multiple rings that marked his wealth and status. "He doesn't look particularly impressive." "Appearances can be deceiving," Balbus replied smoothly. "Lucius has a unique fighting style, thoughtful, strategic. The crowds find it intriguing, especially when contrasted with more aggressive opponents." Corvus stopped in front of Lucius, meeting his eyes directly. "Do you speak, Gaul?" "When spoken to, Dominus," Lucius answered, using the respectful form of address for a potential patron. A thin smile crossed Corvus's face, and educated enough to know his place. "Interesting." He turned back to Balbus. "I'm planning games for next month, part of my campaign for Aedile. I need memorable matches, fighters who will make an impression." "Lucius would certainly qualify," Balbus said eagerly. "Perhaps paired against a Thracian. The contrast in styles would make for an excellent spectacle." "Perhaps." Corvus's gaze returned to Lucius. "I'll consider it. My games must be exceptional. The voters remember both generosity and entertainment when they cast their ballots. After Corvus departed, Balbus made it clear to Lucius just how important such patronage could be. Corvus is rising in influence. His games will attract the attention of everyone who matters in Rome. Impress there, and your value increases exponentially. And if I fail to impress? Lucius asked, already knowing the answer. Balbus's expression hardened. Then I'll have invested considerable time and resources in a disappointing asset. I'm sure you understand the implications. The implications were indeed clear. Success meant continued investment and potentially, eventually, freedom. Failure meant death in the arena, or at best, being sold to a lesser ludus or mine where life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. As preparations for Corvus's games began, Lucius's training regimen intensified further. It was confirmed that he would indeed fight a Thracian, a gladiator type, armed with a curved short sword and small round shield, known for aggressive, mobile fighting styles. His specific opponent would be Thraex, a fighter from a rival ludus with a reputation for both skill and showmanship. He plays to the crowd constantly, Cassius warned during a strategy session. Flashy moves, dramatic gestures. The common folk love him for it, and the patricians tolerate it because it keeps the masses entertained. How do I counter that? Lucius asked. You don't try to match his theatrics. That's his domain. You present the contrast, disciplined, efficient, implacable. The thoughtful warrior against the wild barbarian. Cassius demonstrated a series of controlled movements. Let him exhaust himself with unnecessary flourishes while you maintain your energy and focus. The wisdom of this approach made sense to Lucius, who had never been inclined toward flamboyance even before his life as a gladiator. He dedicated himself to perfecting the disciplined strategic style that was becoming his trademark, trusting that it would provide sufficient contrast to his opponent's showmanship to create the memorable spectacle Corvus demanded. As the day of the games approached, Lucius found himself seeking out Flavia more frequently, ostensibly for treatment of minor training injuries, but in reality, for the comfort of her presence. Their conversations, once limited to brief exchanges about wounds and healing, had gradually expanded to include careful sharing of personal histories and cautious expressions of concern for each other's well-being. You seem troubled, she observed during one such visit, as she applied a poultice to a bruised shoulder. Corvus's games carry high expectations, Lucius admitted. Balbus has made it clear that much depends on my performance. Flavia's hands paused briefly in their work. I've heard about Corvus. He's known for spectacular matches, often to the death. The crowds at his games are particularly bloodthirsty. So I've been told. She resumed applying the poultice, her touch gentle despite the matter-of-fact tone of her voice. Then you should know that mercy is rarely granted at his events, regardless of how well both fighters perform. He believes death makes for more memorable entertainment. The information wasn't surprising, but hearing it stated so plainly still sent a chill through Lucius. Then I'll have to ensure I'm not the one who falls. Yes. Flavia's eyes met his, concern evident despite her attempt at clinical detachment. You will. The day of Corvus's games dawned clear and hot, a typical Roman summer day that promised to become sweltering by afternoon. The games were being held in one of the larger amphitheaters, reflecting Corvus's political ambitions and desire to accommodate as many potential voters as possible. When Lucius and the other fighters arrived, the venue was already filling with spectators eager for the day's entertainment. The hypodrome beneath this amphitheater was larger and better organized than the one where Lucius had fought his first match. Separate areas were designated for different types of fighters, for the wild beasts that would participate in the morning hunts and for the condemned criminals who would be executed as part of the day's events. Guards and officials moved efficiently through the space, maintaining order and ensuring the complex schedule proceeded as planned. Lucius's match was scheduled for mid-afternoon, one of the featured contests that would follow the beast hunts and precede the grand finale. As he prepared, he found himself approached by an unfamiliar man in the plain tunic of a ludus physician. "Lucius of Gaul?" the man inquired. At Lucius's nod, he continued, "I bring a message from Thraex. He says to tell you that he respects your skill and hopes for a contest worthy of the gods' attention." The formal greeting between opponents was a tradition among some gladiators, though not universally observed. That Thraex had initiated such a gesture suggested a certain professional courtesy that Lucius hadn't necessarily expected. "Tell him I return his respect and look forward to testing my skill against his," Lucius replied, the formal response coming naturally, despite never having exchanged such messages before. The messenger nodded and departed, leaving Lucius to continue his preparations with a slightly altered perspective on his opponent. Not just a showman then, but a fighter who observed the traditions and courtesies of their shared profession, however unwillingly they might have entered it. The hours passed with the familiar mixture of tense anticipation and enforced patience. Lucius listened to the sounds from above, the roars of beasts, the shouts of the crowd, the occasional blast of trumpets signaling notable events, and prepared himself mentally for what was to come. When an official finally approached to inform him that his match would begin shortly, he felt a calm readiness that would have been unimaginable during his first fight. He donned his armor methodically, checking each piece with the care Cassius had instilled in him. The helmet, the arm guards, the distinctive Mamiyo's leg greave on his left leg, each item a part of the identity he would present to the crowd. His shield and gladius, now familiar extensions of his body after months of training, completed the transformation from man to gladiator. The procession into the arena was more elaborate than his previous experiences, befitting the political nature of Corvus's games. Musicians, dancers, and ceremonial guards preceded the gladiators, creating a spectacle designed to impress the assembled citizens with the sponsors' wealth and generosity. When Lucius finally emerged into the sunlight, the crowd's roar was deafening, the tiers of seating packed with spectators waving colored cloths and banners representing their favored fighters. After the ceremonial parade and the traditional salute to the sponsor, the fighters not scheduled for immediate matches were led back to the hypogeum to await their turns. Lucius used this time to center himself, finding that space between fear and recklessness that his father had taught him to seek. When he was finally called for his match, he rose with the calm purpose of a man who had accepted both the possibility of death and the determination to avoid it if possible. Re-entering the arena for his contest, Lucius was struck by the intensity of the atmosphere. Corvus had spared no expense in creating a memorable spectacle. Colored awnings shaded the more expensive seats. Attendants moved through the crowd, distributing wine and light refreshments, and musicians played during breaks between matches to maintain the festive atmosphere. In the sponsor's box, Corvus himself reclined in an ornate chair, surrounded by political allies and potential supporters he wished to impress. From the opposite entrance came Thraex, his distinctive armor identifying him immediately. The small round shield, arm guards, distinctive helmet with its stylized griffin crest, and the curved Seeker sword that was the signature weapon of his gladiator type. He acknowledged the crowd with dramatic gestures, turning in a full circle with arms raised to encourage their cheers. The contrast between them was immediately apparent and exactly as Cassius had described. Where Thraex played to the crowd with expansive movements and theatrical flourishes, Lucius presented a contained, focused presence, acknowledging the spectators with dignity but without pandering. They approached the center of the arena, where the referee waited. The formal instructions were given, though both fighters knew the rules of their profession intimately by now. The referee stepped back, signaled to the musicians to halt, and with a sharp downward gesture, began the contest. Thraex lived up to his reputation immediately, opening with a series of quick, flashy attacks designed as much to entertain as to test Lucius's defenses. His curved sword darted in from unexpected angles, forcing Lucius to make constant adjustments with his shield. The crowd responded enthusiastically to each dramatic move, calling out encouragement and appreciation. Lucius maintained his discipline, neither attempting to match Thraex's showmanship nor allowing himself to be drawn into a premature counterattack. He gave ground strategically, studying his opponent's patterns and tendencies while conserving his energy. This measured approach drew some impatient calls from spectators, hungry for immediate action, but others, particularly among the more knowledgeable observers, watched with appreciation for the tactical chess match unfolding before them. The initial exchange continued for several minutes, neither fighter gaining a significant advantage. Thraex's attacks, while visually impressive, were consistently turned aside by Lucius's careful defense, and when Lucius did counterattack, his movements were efficient and precise, forcing Thraex to interrupt his performance to defend himself. As the contest progressed, a subtle shift began to occur. Thraex's movements, while still dramatic, lost some of their initial crispness as exertion took its toll. The flashy attacks that had excited the crowd early on now came with longer pauses between them, and his breathing grew more labored within his helmet. Lucius, who had paced himself deliberately, now began to press his advantage. His attacks came more frequently, each one calculated and controlled, but increasing in intensity. Thraex found himself forced to give ground, his defensive movements becoming more desperate as Lucius methodically broke down his guard. The crowd, sensing the shifting momentum, adjusted their reactions accordingly. Those who had initially favored Thraex's showmanship now responded to Lucius's disciplined dismantling of his opponent. The appreciation for spectacle gave way to appreciation for skill, particularly when Lucius executed a perfectly timed shield bash that momentarily staggered Thraex, followed by a sword thrust that opened a shallow cut across his opponent's thigh. First blood to Lucius. The crowd roared its approval, and even in Corvus's box there were appreciative nods at the display of technique. Thraex, recognizing the precariousness of his position, adjusted his approach. The purely theatrical elements of his fighting style fell away, replaced by a more practical focus on survival and counterattack. He was, underneath the showmanship, a skilled fighter who had survived previous contests through ability as well as crowd appeal. The fight entered a new phase, more balanced and technically impressive. Both men were now fully engaged in the serious business of combat, each seeking the decisive advantage that would end the contest in their favor. They circled, attacked, defended, and counterattacked in a deadly dance that demonstrated the highest levels of their gladiatorial training. The summer heat intensified their struggle, sweat pouring from both fighters, making shield grips slippery and footing treacherous on the sand. A momentary loss of traction caused Lucius to stumble slightly, and Thraex immediately capitalized, his curved blade slipping past Lucius's guard to open a cut on his sword arm. Now both men were bleeding, though neither wound was severe enough to significantly impact their fighting ability. The crowd's excitement reached new heights as they sensed the contest approaching its climax. In the sponsor's box, Corvus leaned forward, his attention fully captured by the drama playing out before him. It was Lucius who finally broke the deadlock. Recognizing a pattern in Thraex's movements, a slight tell before he committed to a particular attack, Lucius set a trap. He deliberately created what appeared to be an opening in his defense, anticipating Thraex's response and preparing his counter. The gambit worked perfectly. Thraex, seeing the apparent vulnerability, launched exactly the attack Lucius had predicted. But instead of finding his target, Thraex's sword met empty air as Lucius sidestepped with precise timing. Before Thraex could recover, Lucius's gladius struck decisively, driving into the gap between shoulder and chest armor with carefully controlled force, deep enough to disable but not to kill. Thraex dropped to his knees, his sword falling from suddenly nerveless fingers, his left hand raised in the gesture of surrender. The referee stepped forward, signaling for the decision as the crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers, calls for mercy, and the inevitable bloodthirsty demands for death. All eyes turned to Corvus. The sponsor rose in his box, making a show of considering the fighters before him. Lucius stood ready, his sword still raised, awaiting the verdict that would determine whether his victory would be sealed with his opponent's blood. Thraex remained on his knees, head bowed, the traditional posture of a defeated gladiator. Corvus's thumb remained horizontal for a long moment as he gauged the crowd's mood and calculated the political value of each possible decision. Finally, it turned downward. Death. The response that would provide the most memorable conclusion to a contest that had already impressed his potential voters. A chill ran through Lucius despite the heat of the day. He had known this moment would come eventually, the point where survival would require taking another fighter's life. Until now, fortune or the whims of sponsors had spared him this final test. But today, in Corvus's games, there would be no such reprieve. Thraex raised his head, meeting Lucius's eyes through the narrow openings of their helmets. There was no plea there, no desperate begging for mercy that couldn't be granted. Only the silent acknowledgement between professionals that fate had decreed one would continue and one would not. He tilted his head slightly, exposing his neck for a clean strike. His final request, not for life, but for a dignified death. Lucius adjusted his grip on his sword, preparing for the thrust that would end Thraex's life. In that moment, time seemed to slow, and the roar of the crowd receded to a distant murmur. He thought of his sister's plea, "Live, Lucius," and the promise he had made. He thought of Flavia's words about finding ways to remain human despite everything. He thought of all the choices that had been taken from him since his capture and enslavement, and this one terrible choice that now remained his to make. With deliberate precision, Lucius delivered the fatal stroke, quick, clean, and as merciful as such an act could be. Thraex's body slumped forward onto the sand, blood pooling beneath him. His suffering ended with professional efficiency rather than drawn out for the crowd's entertainment. The spectators roared their approval, satisfied with the decisive conclusion to an impressive contest. In the sponsor's box, Corvus nodded his satisfaction, having received the memorable spectacle he had demanded. For the citizens of Rome, it was simply another entertaining death in an afternoon filled with diversions. For Lucius, it was transformation. As he raised his sword in the traditional salute to the sponsor and then to the crowd, he felt a fundamental shift within himself, a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. He had taken a life not in self-defense or the heat of battle, but in cold obedience to the rules of a game he had never chosen to play. As he was escorted from the arena, victorious but changed, the cheers of the crowd followed him down into the Hypogeum. There, away from the public eye, he removed his helmet and allowed himself a moment of private reckoning with what he had done. The face that stared back at him from the polished interior of his helmet was still recognizably his own, but the eyes held something new, a hardness, a distance that hadn't been there before. Caius Balbus was waiting, his face flushed with pleasure at the success of his investment. "Magnificent, Gaul! Corvus himself has expressed his approval. Your stock rises with every performance." Lucius nodded mechanically, going through the motions of accepting congratulations, while his mind remained partially in the arena with the man whose life he had taken. The physician attended to his wound, minor compared to the invisible damage done to his spirit, and preparations were made for the return journey to the Ludus. As they left the amphitheater, Lucius caught sight of Thraex's body being carried away by attendants from his Ludus. In death, stripped of his armor, he appeared smaller somehow, just another man whose existence had been reduced to a brief moment of entertainment for the citizens of Rome. No different from what Lucius himself might become on some future afternoon, when his skill or luck finally failed him. The return to the Ludus was marked by celebration. Balbus, eager to capitalize on Lucius's growing reputation, hosted a small feast for his successful fighters and invited select patrons to observe his prized assets in a more social setting. Lucius was required to attend, to accept compliments and answer questions about his techniques and training, while the wealthy guests eyed him with the curious detachment of people examining an unusual animal. He performed this role as required, providing the responses expected of him while maintaining the dignified demeanor that had become part of his public persona. But throughout the evening, a part of him remained detached, observing himself and the proceedings with the same strategic awareness he brought to his fights, calculating what was necessary for survival in this context, just as he did in the arena. When finally released from these obligations, Lucius sought solitude in his cell, but sleep eluded him. The events of the day played repeatedly in his mind, not just the fight and its fatal conclusion, but all the moments that had led to that point, and all the possible futures that might follow from it. A soft knock at his door interrupted these circular thoughts. He opened it to find Flavia, her expression solemn as she studied his face. "I heard about your victory," she said quietly, "and its outcome." "News travels quickly," Lucius replied, stepping back to allow her to enter. "The Ludus has little else to discuss." She carried her familiar kit of healing supplies, though his physical wound hardly warranted such attention. "I came to check your arm." He sat on the edge of his sleeping mat, extending his injured arm for her inspection. The wound had been properly cleaned and stitched at the amphitheater, but she removed the bandage and examined it carefully nonetheless, her touch gentle and thorough. "It's healing well," she pronounced, applying fresh salve before rewrapping it. "No signs of infection." "Thank you," Lucius said, knowing they were both aware that her visit had little to do with the minor cut. Flavia finished her task, but didn't immediately move to leave. "The first kill changes you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen it happen to many men here." "And how do they change?" "Some embrace it, find a taste for blood that makes them more effective in the arena, but less human outside it." Her eyes held his steadily. "Others are broken by it, lose whatever center kept them whole, and rarely survive their next fight." "And the rest?" "The rest find a way to carry it without being consumed by it." She hesitated, then added, "Like Cassius." The comparison surprised Lucius. Cassius has killed many times in the arena. Yes, and yet he remains himself, changed, scarred, hardened, but not lost. Flavia's hand moved as if to touch his face, then stopped, returning to her lap. "That's what I hope for you." The simple expression of concern, perhaps the first genuine care anyone had shown for his well-being since his enslavement, broke through the numbness that had enveloped Lucius since the fight. Something shifted in his chest, a tight knot of emotion he had been suppressing finally unraveling. "I made a choice today," he said, his voice rough with feelings he couldn't fully identify. "The only choice left to me, to live by taking another's life. Yes." Flavia's answer held no judgment, only acknowledgement of a truth they both understood. "And I'll have to make that choice again and again, until eventually someone makes it for me." The stark reality of his existence had never been clearer. "Or until you earn your freedom," she countered softly. The mention of freedom, that distant possibility that had begun to take shape in his mind, hung between them. For a gladiator of growing reputation, it was not impossible. Many fights, many victories, enough money earned for the Ludus, and eventually manumission might be granted. Years away, perhaps, but not entirely beyond reach. "And what about you?" Lucius asked, the question emerging before he could consider its implications. "What freedom awaits you?" Flavia's expression closed slightly, the vulnerability of the moment partially retreating behind the protective mask she habitually wore. "Healers are valuable. Balbus will never sell me unless forced by financial necessity, and he's unlikely to ever free me." She shrugged with practiced indifference. "Such is the fate assigned to me." Impulsively, Lucius reached for her hand, surprising both of them with the gesture. "If I earn my freedom, I would purchase yours." The promise hung in the air between them, both impossible and deeply sincere. Flavia's fingers tightened briefly around his before she gently withdrew her hand. "Dreams are dangerous luxuries for people like us," she said, though the softness in her eyes belied the practical caution of her words. "Focus on surviving tomorrow before planning for distant years." She rose to leave, gathering her healing supplies. At the door she paused, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "Rest now. Your body needs to heal, even if your mind cannot yet find peace." After she left, Lucius lay back on his sleeping mat, staring at the ceiling of his small cell. The events of the day still weighed heavily upon him, but something had shifted. A purpose beyond mere survival had begun to take root. Not just to live through the next fight and the next, but to live towards something. Freedom, yes, but also the possibility of helping someone else achieve it as well. It was a dangerous thought, as Flavia had warned. Dangerous because hope could be more painful than resignation when inevitably crushed. Dangerous because attachment to another person meant creating a vulnerability that could be exploited. Dangerous because planning for a future meant believing in a future, which few gladiators could afford to do. Yet as sleep finally claimed him in the quiet hours before dawn, that dangerous thought remained, a small flame of possibility in the darkness of his circumstances. Whatever changes today's fight had wrought in him, whatever hardness or distance had entered his eyes, this fragile hope might be the counterbalance that would keep him from losing himself entirely to the arena. The weeks following Lucius's first kill brought both the professional advancement Balbus had predicted and the personal reckoning Flavia had warned about. His reputation grew, his name increasingly recognized by regular attendees of the Games. Training sessions were now often observed by potential sponsors considering him for their events. His accommodations and diet improved further as Balbus continued to invest in his valuable asset. But in the quiet moments between public appearances and training, Lucius grappled with the reality of what he had become. The memory of Thraex faded gradually from sharp detail to general impression, not forgotten, but absorbed into the new identity Lucius was forming. Not just a slave fighting for survival, but a gladiator with growing skill and reputation. Not just a victim of circumstance, but a man making what choices remained available to him within his constraints. Cassius, recognizing the transition his student was undergoing, adjusted his approach accordingly. Training sessions now included not just physical techniques, but philosophical discussions about life in the arena and beyond it. "The worst mistake a gladiator can make," Cassius told him during one such conversation, "is to believe that his only value lies in killing or being killed. The Romans may see us that way, but we need not see ourselves through their eyes." "How do you see yourself then?" Lucius asked, curious about the inner life of this man who had survived years in a profession where most died within months. Cassius was silent for a long moment, his scarred face impassive as he considered the question. "As a man playing a role," he finally said, "in the arena I am Cassius the gladiator, the killer, the entertainer. But here," he tapped his chest, "I remain Theodoros of Alexandria, son of a shipbuilder who still remembers the smell of cedar and salt air." The distinction resonated with Lucius, who had been struggling to reconcile the farmer's son from Gaul with the arena fighter he had become. Perhaps they could coexist, rather than one erasing the other. The gladiator, a role he played for survival while preserving his true self within. This perspective helped him approach his next fights with a different mindset. Over the following months, Lucius participated in several more contests, some ending in his opponent's death, others in mercy granted by sponsors more interested in preserving valuable fighters than in final bloodshed. He performed his role with increasing skill, developing a fighting style that combined technical precision with just enough dramatic flair to satisfy the crowd's expectations. His relationship with Flavia deepened cautiously, constrained by the realities of their environment where any attachment represented vulnerability. Their conversations, once limited to healing and occasional philosophical observations, gradually included shared memories of their lives before enslavement and carefully expressed hopes for the future. Nothing that could be called love was openly acknowledged between them. Such a luxury seemed beyond their circumstances, but a bond formed nonetheless, a mutual recognition of humanity in a place designed to strip it away. Approximately a year after Lucius's first arena appearance, a significant opportunity arose. The games, celebrating the dedication of the newly completed Colosseum, were being planned. A spectacular multi-day event that would feature the finest gladiators from throughout the empire. Participation would mean fighting against the best of the best, with correspondingly higher risks, but also greater potential rewards in terms of reputation and purse. Caius Balbus called Lucius to his private quarters to discuss the possibility. The Lannister's office reflected his prosperity. Fine furniture, decorative artworks, and shelves of accounting scrolls that tracked the business of death and entertainment with meticulous precision. "You've exceeded my initial assessment of your potential," Balbus admitted, pouring wine for himself without offering any to Lucius. 12 fights, 9 victories, 3 defeats with mercy granted. An impressive record for a man with no previous combat experience. "Thank you, Dominus," Lucius replied, maintaining the respectful demeanor expected of even a successful gladiator when addressing his owner. The Colosseum Games represent an opportunity and a risk. Balbus swirled the wine in his cup, studying its movement rather than looking directly at Lucius. "The finest fighters in the Empire will be there. Many will not return to their ludi. I understand. Do you?" Balbus's gaze shifted to Lucius, suddenly sharp. "This isn't just about survival anymore. This is about investment and return. I've put considerable resources into your development. The potential rewards of your participation are significant, but so is the potential loss if you die." The calculating assessment was typical of Balbus, who viewed his gladiators purely in terms of profit and loss. What was unusual was his apparent hesitation about risking a valuable asset, suggesting that he truly did see significant value in Lucius's continued survival. "What would you have me do, Dominus?" Lucius asked, recognizing that despite the consultation, he ultimately had no real choice in the matter. Balbus set down his wine cup. "You'll participate, but not as originally planned. I've arranged a specific match, you against Tiberian, the champion of Titus Aquila's Ludus." The name was familiar to Lucius. Tiberian was indeed famous, a veteran of over 20 fights with an unbroken string of victories. He was known for a ruthlessly efficient fighting style that made for relatively brief but intensely violent contests. "He's never lost," Lucius observed, keeping his voice neutral. "Exactly, which makes defeating him particularly valuable." Balbus smiled thinly. "The odds will be heavily against you, allowing for substantial betting profits when you win." When, not if." Lucius couldn't help the skeptical note that crept into his voice. "I'm not sending you to die, Gaul." Balbus rose, moving to a chest from which he withdrew a scroll. "This contains everything we know about Tiberian, his techniques, patterns, weaknesses. You'll have a month to prepare specifically for him. Cassius will focus your training entirely on countering his particular style." The thoroughness of the preparation was unexpected, but reassuring. Balbus was approaching this as a calculated risk rather than a sacrifice, genuinely believing that Lucius could prevail against the undefeated champion. "And if I do defeat him?" Lucius asked. "Then your value increases dramatically. A few more such victories, and we might discuss the possibility of manumission in a few years." Balbus's expression made it clear this was no idle promise, but a business proposition. Successful former gladiators who remain loyal to their old ludi can be valuable associates, trainers, scouts for new talent, representatives to potential sponsors. The explicit mention of potential freedom, however distant, sent a jolt through Lucius. Until now, it had been a vague possibility, rather than a concrete proposal. That Balbus would mention it specifically suggested he truly did see long-term value in Lucius beyond his immediate fighting career. "I understand, Dominus," Lucius said, his mind already beginning to analyze the implications and possibilities. "I won't disappoint your investment." The month of preparation that followed was the most intense period of training Lucius had experienced since arriving at the Ludus. Every aspect of his regimen was tailored to the specific challenge of facing Tiberian. Cassius, who had once observed the champion in combat, provided insights into his techniques and tendencies. "He relies on overwhelming aggression," Cassius explained during one session. "No wasted movement, no theatrical flourishes, just relentless pressure until his opponent makes a fatal mistake." "How has no one defeated him using that knowledge?" Lucius asked, practicing the defensive movements Cassius had demonstrated. "Because knowing his approach doesn't make countering it easy. He's exceptionally fast and strong, and he's been fighting this way for years. His body knows the patterns, even if his mind doesn't consciously plan them. They work tirelessly on developing strategies to neutralize Tiberian's advantages, ways to absorb and redirect his aggression, to maintain defensive integrity under pressure, to identify the small windows of opportunity that might appear between his attacks." As the date of the contest approached, word spread throughout the Ludus about the high-profile match. Other gladiators offered advice or encouragement based on their own experiences or observations. Even the guards treated Lucius with increased respect, perhaps recognizing that his success reflected well on the entire establishment. Flavia visited more frequently, officially to monitor his physical condition during the intensive training, but equally to provide the emotional support he would never openly request. During one such visit, as she massaged healing oils into muscles strained by the day's exertions, she finally addressed the topic they had been carefully avoiding. "People are saying this fight could be your path to freedom," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "That if you defeat Tiberian and continue your success in the Colosseum Games, Balbus might consider manumission within a few years." "He suggested as much," Lucius confirmed, watching her face for her reaction. Her hands continued their work without pausing, but he noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. "That's good. A concrete goal to work toward. For both of us," he said quietly, referencing the promise he had made months earlier. Flavia's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their rhythmic movement. "Lucius," she began, then stopped, clearly struggling to find the right words. "Don't burden yourself with additional promises before the most important battle of your life. Focus on survival first. Everything else must come later." "Is it a burden to have something worth surviving for?" he asked, "beyond just continuing to breathe?" She met his eyes then, her professional mask slipping to reveal a complex mixture of emotions: hope, fear, affection, and the practical caution that survival in their world demanded. "No," she admitted softly, "but it is a vulnerability, and Tiberian will exploit any vulnerability he finds." Her concern was valid, and Lucius knew it. To enter the arena with divided focus, with thoughts of future possibilities rather than immediate survival, was indeed dangerous. Yet he also recognized that without such possibilities, without some purpose beyond the next breath or heartbeat, the will to continue might eventually falter. "I'll focus," he promised, "but afterward, we'll speak of this again." The day of the contest finally arrived, coinciding with the first day of the inaugural games at the completed Colosseum. The massive amphitheater, officially the Flavian Amphitheater but already commonly called the Colosseum for the colossal statue of Nero that had once stood nearby, dominated the heart of Rome. Its imposing exterior of travertine limestone rose in multiple stories of arches, while inside it could accommodate more than 50,000 spectators arranged according to strict social hierarchies. The hypogeum beneath the Colosseum was a marvel of engineering, a complex network of tunnels, chambers, and mechanical systems designed to support the elaborate spectacles staged in the arena above. Cages held exotic animals from across the empire. Hoists and elevators stood ready to raise fighters and beasts dramatically into view, and hundreds of slaves, guards, and officials moved through the space in carefully choreographed patterns. Lucius's fight was scheduled for the afternoon of the first day, not the most prestigious position, which was reserved for the final day's contests, but still a significant acknowledgement of the match's anticipated entertainment value. As he prepared in the designated area, he could hear the sounds of the morning's events, beast hunts and preliminary gladiatorial contests designed to whet the audience's appetite for the featured matches to come. Balbus visited briefly, ostensibly to check on his investment, but perhaps also to provide encouragement in his own calculating way. "The betting is heavily against you, as expected," he informed Lucius. "The odds make victory extremely profitable. Don't disappoint me." After the Lanista departed, Cassius arrived for a final strategy review. "Remember what we discussed," he said, his voice low and intense. "Don't try to match his aggression. Absorb, redirect, wait for him to overextend. It won't happen often, but when it does, you must capitalize immediately." Lucius nodded, mentally reviewing the patterns they had practiced countless times over the past month. "I'm ready." Cassius studied him for a moment, then clasped his shoulder in a rare gesture of physical support. "You are. Now prove it to Rome." As the time for his match approached, Lucius completed his final preparations. The ritual meal, the prayers to whatever gods might be listening, the meticulous checking of armor and weapons. When the summoner came to escort him to the arena entrance, he felt the familiar calm focus descend, the mental state he had cultivated for combat, where fear and hope were equally set aside in favor of absolute presence in the moment. The entrance to the arena from below was a new experience, rising on a platform elevator rather than walking through gates as in smaller amphitheaters. One moment Lucius was in the dimly lit hypogeum, the next he was emerging into blinding sunlight and the overwhelming roar of the largest crowd he had ever faced. The Colosseum's arena spread before him, its white sand pristine and unmarked despite the morning's events. Around him rose tier upon tier of seating, filled with what seemed like half of Rome's population. Colorful awnings shaded the upper levels, banners and standards decorated the various sections, and the excited buzz of thousands of voices created a wall of sound that was almost physical in its intensity. From the opposite side of the arena, another elevator raised Tiberian into view. The champion cut an impressive figure, taller than Lucius, his muscular body bearing the scars of many contests but moving with fluid confidence that belied his years of combat. He acknowledged the crowd's enthusiastic greeting with a raised sword, his reputation clearly earning him the status of favorite among the spectators. The announcer's voice boomed across the space, introducing the fighters with elaborate descriptions of their accomplishments and attributes. Tiberian's lengthy list of victories drew appreciative cheers, while Lucius's briefer but impressive record elicited curious murmurs from those who had not yet seen the Gallic strategist in action. They approached the center of the arena where the referee awaited. Up close, Tiberian was even more imposing, his eyes within his helmet revealing nothing but cool assessment as he sized up his opponent. The referee provided the standard instructions and warnings, then stepped back to signal the beginning of the contest. Tiberian lived up to his reputation immediately. There was no cautious circling, no testing of defenses, just an explosive surge forward and a series of powerful strikes that forced Lucius into immediate defensive action. The champion's style was exactly as Cassius had described. Relentless pressure applied with technical precision and overwhelming force. For the first few minutes, Lucius could do nothing but defend, using all the techniques he had practiced to absorb and redirect Tiberian's assault without being overwhelmed by it. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some appreciated the display of defensive skill, others grew restless at the lack of blood or dramatic exchanges. Gradually, however, Lucius began to find the pattern within Tiberian's assault. There was a rhythm to his combinations, a predictability born of successful repetition over many fights. This wasn't a weakness exactly. The techniques worked even when anticipated because they were executed with such speed and power, but it did provide the faint outline of a strategy. Lucius began to move more proactively, still primarily defensive, but now with occasional counter-strikes, timed to interrupt Tiberian's rhythm. Most were blocked or dodged, but a few found their mark, drawing surprised murmurs from the crowd and a momentary reassessment from Tiberian himself. The first significant exchange came when Lucius successfully anticipated a particular combination and stepped inside Tiberian's guard, landing a solid blow to the champion's side. It wasn't a serious wound, but it was the first time in the fight that Tiberian had been clearly struck, and the crowd responded with increased interest. Tiberian adjusted his approach, becoming more methodical without sacrificing his fundamental aggression. The fight settled into a more balanced contest, with both men landing occasional blows but neither gaining a decisive advantage. The summer heat and the intensity of the combat began to take its toll, sweat pouring from both fighters, breathing becoming more labored within their confining helmets. As they circled each other during a brief respite, Tiberian spoke for the first time. "You're better than I expected, Gaul," he said, his voice low and controlled despite his exertion. "You're exactly as good as I expected," Lucius replied honestly. A short laugh escaped Tiberian. "Then you expected to die today. We'll see." The exchange ended as they re-engaged, Tiberian launching another series of attacks that drove Lucius back toward the edge of the arena. The crowd's excitement built as they sensed the fight approaching a critical juncture. Tiberian pressed his advantage, perhaps seeing an opportunity to end the contest against the unexpectedly resilient opponent. It was in this moment, with his back figuratively against the wall, that Lucius recognized the opening they had trained for. Tiberian, in his eagerness to finish the fight, had slightly overextended on a powerful thrust. The window of opportunity was tiny, a fraction of a second in which the champion's balance was marginally compromised. But Lucius had been waiting for precisely this moment. With the fluid movement drilled into muscle memory through countless practice sessions, Lucius sidestepped the thrust, while simultaneously striking Tiberian's sword arm with his shield. The impact wasn't enough to disarm the champion, but did disrupt his recovery, creating a momentary vulnerability that Lucius exploited with a quick, precise sword thrust to the gap between chest and shoulder armor. The blade struck true, penetrating deeply enough to cause serious injury, but not immediately fatal damage. Tiberian staggered, blood flowing freely from the wound, his sword arm suddenly weakened, but not completely disabled. The crowd erupted at this unexpected turn, sensing that the undefeated champion might actually fall. Tiberian, however, had not survived 20 battles by succumbing to a single wound, however serious. He switched his sword to his left hand, less skilled but still dangerous, and launched a desperate counterattack. The sudden change in fighting style momentarily caught Lucius off guard, and one wild swing slipped past his defense to open a gash across his thigh. Both men now bleeding, they circled more cautiously, each aware that the next exchange could be decisive. The crowd's roar had reached deafening levels, the spectators on their feet throughout the vast amphitheater, witnessing what many had thought impossible, the potential defeat of the undefeated champion. Lucius knew he couldn't allow Tiberian time to adjust to fighting left-handed or to find a second wind despite his injury. With calculated risk, he pressed forward, forcing Tiberian into a defensive posture unfamiliar to a fighter accustomed to dictating the pace of combat. The champion's responses were increasingly desperate, his left-handed technique lacking the precision of his dominant hand, his movements hampered by pain and blood loss. The end came suddenly. Tiberian attempted a powerful swing meant to force Lucius back, but the unfamiliar motion with his offhand left him momentarily overbalanced. Lucius deflected the blow and stepped in close, driving his gladius up beneath Tiberian's guard and into his chest with enough force to penetrate the armor. For a moment, they stood locked together, almost in an embrace, as Tiberian's body registered the fatal wound. Then the champion's knees buckled and he collapsed onto the sand, his sword falling from nerveless fingers, his life bleeding out into the pristine white ground of the Colosseum. The arena fell into a stunned silence before erupting into chaotic noise. Cheers, gasps, exclamations of disbelief. The undefeated had been defeated. The champion had fallen. And Lucius of Gaul, relatively unknown before this day, had accomplished what many had thought impossible. The referee approached, confirming what was already evident. Tiberian was dead or dying, beyond any question of mercy. He raised Lucius's arm in the formal gesture of victory, and the crowd's response reached new heights of enthusiasm. In the imperial box, the emperor himself leaned forward with increased interest, taking note of the fighter who had provided such unexpected entertainment. As attendants rushed forward to assist the wounded victor and remove the fallen champion, Lucius stood momentarily frozen in the center of the arena, the enormity of what had just occurred washing over him. He had defeated Tiberian. He had killed the undefeated champion in front of the largest audience imaginable. His life had just changed in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. The journey back to the Ludus was markedly different from any previous return. Word of his victory had spread rapidly through Rome, and crowds gathered along the route to catch a glimpse of the man who had defeated the seemingly invincible Tiberian. At the Ludus itself, an atmosphere of celebration greeted his arrival, not just for the prestige of the victory, but for the substantial financial windfall it represented through betting profits. Caius Balbus, flushed with wine and success, greeted Lucius personally as he was helped from the cart, his wounded leg making movement difficult. "Magnificent!" the Lannister exclaimed, his usual calculating demeanor temporarily overwhelmed by genuine excitement. "You've made history today, Gaul, and made me a very rich man in the process." Lucius acknowledged the praise with a nod, too exhausted and pain-ridden for more elaborate response. He was quickly taken to the physician's chambers, where Stephanos and Flavia waited to tend to his injuries. As they worked, Balbus continued to expound on the significance of the victory. "Offers are already coming in," he said, pacing the small room with restless energy. "Every sponsor wants you for their games now. The Emperor himself took notice. There's talk of featuring you in the final day's main event." The implications were both promising and concerning. Greater prominence meant greater rewards, but also greater risks. Higher profile opponents, higher expectations, more dangerous fights. But it also meant accelerated progress toward the goal that now seemed more attainable than ever: freedom. As if reading his thoughts, Balbus paused in his excited monologue. "This changes your trajectory significantly. Continue this success, and manumission could be a reality much sooner than I previously suggested, perhaps even within a year or two, rather than 5 or more." The explicit confirmation of what Lucius had hoped sent a surge of energy through his pain-fogged mind. Freedom within a year or two. Not a distant dream, but a realistic possibility. And with freedom, the ability to fulfill his promise to Flavia, to offer her the same liberation he might achieve for himself. He glanced at her as she worked on his wound, her face carefully composed to reveal nothing of her thoughts in Balbus's presence. But her eyes, when they briefly met his, contained a spark of the same hope that had ignited within him. Cautious, guarded, but undeniably present. The days following his victory were a whirlwind of activity and attention. Wealthy patrons visited the Ludus specifically to see the man who had defeated Tiberian. Offers for his appearance in games throughout Italy poured in, requiring Balbus to hire an additional secretary just to manage the correspondence. Lucius's training regimen was adjusted to accommodate his new status: more rest, better food, specialized instruction from the finest fighting masters Balbus could secure. As his wound healed and he returned to full training, Lucius found his relationship with the other gladiators subtly altered. There was new respect in their interactions, acknowledgement that he had accomplished something truly exceptional. Even Cassius, typically sparing with praise, admitted that the victory had exceeded his expectations. "You executed perfectly," the veteran said during a light sparring session designed to help Lucius regain his form without aggravating his healing injury. "Exactly as we trained, but with the adaptability to seize the moment when it presented itself. I had an excellent teacher," Lucius replied, genuinely grateful for the older man's guidance. Cassius shrugged off the compliment. "Teachers can only show the path. Walking it requires something within the student himself." He paused, studying Lucius with uncharacteristic openness. "You have it. Whatever quality separates those who merely survive from those who truly succeed in our profession." "And what happens to those who succeed?" Lucius asked, the question encompassing far more than just arena victories. Cassius understood the broader inquiry. "Some become legends, then corpses, their success eventually bringing them opponents they cannot defeat. Others transition to freedom, becoming trainers or representatives or entrepreneurs, leveraging their fame." His scarred face revealed little of his own aspirations. "The wisest disappear entirely, leaving their gladiator identities behind, to begin new lives far from Rome and its memories." The conversation reinforced Lucius's own evolving plans. Victory over Tiberian had opened doors, created possibilities that hadn't existed before. Now he needed to navigate those possibilities carefully, maximizing opportunities while minimizing risks, always with the ultimate goal of freedom in mind, not just for himself, but for Flavia as well. The opportunity to discuss these thoughts with her came several nights later, when she visited his quarters under the pretext of checking his healing wound. With his elevated status came greater privacy and fewer questions about such visits, though both remained careful to maintain the appearance of a purely professional relationship. "Balbus has been meeting with sponsors all day," she informed him, as she examined the nearly healed gash on his thigh. "There's talk of a special match during the final day of the Colosseum Games." "Against whom?" Lucius asked, knowing that his next opponent would likely be even more challenging than Tiberian had been. "Rumors vary. Some say the Thracian brothers who fight as a pair. Others mention Maximus, the African who's won 17 consecutive matches." She completed her examination and sat beside him on the sleeping mat. "All dangerous possibilities. All opportunities," he countered softly. Flavia's expression grew serious. "Lucius, what Balbus said about manumission within a year or two, don't let it make you reckless. He's still a businessman first. If risking your life brings greater profit than preserving it, he won't hesitate." "I know." He took her hand, a gesture that had become less tentative between them in recent weeks. "But the path is clearer now than it was before. Freedom, then." He hesitated, uncertain how explicitly to state what had been implied in previous conversations. "Then," she prompted, though her eyes suggested she already knew what he would say, "then I fulfill my promise to you." He met her gaze directly. "I purchase your freedom, and after that, whatever we choose, together or separately, but as free people making our own decisions." The deliberate openness of the statement, acknowledging that freedom might mean different paths for each of them, seemed to touch Flavia deeply. Her fingers tightened around his. "Together," she said quietly, but with unmistakable certainty. "If we both reach freedom, then together. I've had enough of separate." The admission, the clearest declaration of feelings either had allowed themselves, hung in the air between them. In another context, between other people, it might have led immediately to physical expression, but both understood the dangerous vulnerability such intimacy would create in their current circumstances. Better to hold the promise of the future than to risk the fragile present with premature fulfillment. Instead, they spoke of practical matters, the specific steps that would be required to achieve their shared goal, the challenges that remained, the opportunities to be seized. As the night deepened around them, they allowed themselves to imagine life beyond the ludus walls, not in elaborate fantasies of wealth or grandeur, but in simple visions of ordinary freedom. A small dwelling somewhere far from Rome, work that sustained but didn't demean, the ability to make choices based on desire rather than necessity. Eventually, Flavia rose to leave, aware that her absence would soon be noted despite Lucius's privileged status. At the door, she turned back to him, her expression both serious and tender. "Survive," she said simply. "Whatever opponent they put before you, whatever risks present themselves, survive. Everything else can wait." "I promised my sister I would live," Lucius replied. "Now I promise you the same." After she departed, Lucius remained awake for some time, contemplating the path that had brought him to this point, and the road that still lay ahead. From captive to slave to gladiator to potential freedman, transformations both imposed and chosen, each containing elements of both suffering and opportunity. The final day of the inaugural Colosseum Games arrived with all the spectacle and excitement that had been building throughout the week-long celebration. The massive amphitheater was filled to capacity, with thousands unable to gain entrance gathering in the surrounding areas to hear second-hand accounts of the day's events. The emperor himself would be in attendance for the entire program, lending imperial prestige to the culminating contests. As Balbus had predicted, Lucius was indeed scheduled for a featured match, not the absolute main event, which was reserved for a spectacular battle between teams of established champions, but a prominent contest that would take place just before that final spectacle. His opponent would be Maximus, the African fighter whose reputation for both skill and brutality had made him one of the most feared gladiators in Rome. The preparation for this fight had been less thorough than for Tiberian, simply because less was known about Maximus's specific techniques. He was a hoplomachus, a gladiator type, equipped with a small round shield, spear, and short sword, modeled after Greek hoplite soldiers. His fighting style was said to be adaptable rather than formulaic, making it difficult to develop targeted counter-strategies. "Rely on your fundamentals," Cassius had advised during their final training session. "Your analytical approach will serve you better against an unpredictable opponent than any specific technique I could teach you." As Lucius prepared in the hypogeum beneath the Colosseum, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The day's earlier matches had already provided exceptional entertainment, and the crowd's appetite for spectacle had been whetted rather than satisfied. They would expect something truly memorable from the contest between the man who had defeated Tiberian and the fearsome African who had never granted mercy to a fallen opponent. Balbus visited briefly, his manner more subdued than before Lucius's previous match. "Maximus is dangerous in ways Tiberian wasn't," he said without preamble. "Tiberian was technically superior but predictable. Maximus is wild, instinctive. He fights like a force of nature rather than a trained gladiator." "You're concerned," Lucius observed, noting the unusual gravity in the Lannister's demeanor. "I'm protective of my investments," Balbus corrected, though the distinction seemed semantic rather than substantive. "You represent significant potential value, but only if you survive today." He hesitated, then added, "If the tide turns against you, there's no shame in seeking Missio. The crowd respects your victory over Tiberian enough that mercy would likely be granted." The suggestion was surprising coming from Balbus, who typically emphasized victory at all costs. That he would explicitly mention the possibility of surrender indicated genuine concern about the outcome of the upcoming contest. Before Lucius could respond, a commotion near the entrance to the preparation area drew their attention. Guards were escorting someone who clearly didn't belong in the restricted space, a woman in the simple clothing of a ludus slave, Flavia. She spoke urgently to the guards, who seemed unconvinced by whatever explanation she was offering. Balbus frowned and moved toward the disturbance, his authority immediately apparent as the guards straightened to attention at his approach. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, looking from the guards to Flavia with obvious displeasure. "Forgive me, Dominus," Flavia said, her eyes downcast in the proper posture of a slave addressing her owner. "The physician sent me with a special poultice for Lucius's wound. He was concerned it might reopen during the fight without additional treatment. The explanation was plausible enough, though Lucius knew his wound had healed sufficiently to require no such intervention." Balbus studied Flavia for a moment, perhaps suspecting the true purpose of her presence, but calculating whether challenging it was worth the effort. "Apply it quickly and leave," he finally said, turning back to Lucius. "Remember what I said. Victory is preferable, survival essential." With that, he departed, leaving Lucius and Flavia with a small measure of privacy amidst the controlled chaos of the hypogym. Flavia moved to Lucius's side, removing a small pot of salve from the pouch at her waist, maintaining the pretense even though both knew it was unnecessary. As she knelt to apply it to his healed thigh, she spoke in a low voice that wouldn't carry to the guards watching from a respectful distance. "I had to see you before." She left the thought unfinished, her hands working with professional efficiency while her eyes conveyed far more personal concern. "I'm glad you came," Lucius replied softly, "though Balbus might suspect your true purpose." "Let him suspect. I've been a valuable healer for years. He won't discard me for one act of minor deception." She finished applying the salve and rose, meeting his eyes directly. "Come back. Whatever happens in the arena today, find a way to come back." The naked emotion in her voice, so different from her usual careful reserve, struck Lucius deeply. He wanted to embrace her, to offer reassurance beyond words, but such a gesture would be too obvious, too dangerous in their current setting. Instead, he held her gaze, trying to convey through that connection everything that couldn't be spoken aloud. "I will," he promised, the words simple but the commitment behind them absolute. A horn sounded, signaling that the previous match had concluded and preparations for the next contest should begin. The guards moved forward, indicating that Flavia's time was up. She stepped back, resuming the deferential posture of a slave performing assigned duties. "The poultice will help prevent reopening of the wound, Dominus," she said in a louder voice, audible to those nearby. "The physician recommends minimal strain on that leg, if possible." With that, she turned and left, escorted by the guards back to the area where Ludus support staff were permitted to observe the proceedings. Lucius watched her go, then turned his attention to the final preparations for his match. His armor was checked one last time, his weapons inspected for any flaws, his mind focused on the challenge ahead. When the time came to enter the arena, Lucius ascended on the same elevator platform that had raised him for his contest against Tiberian. The machinery creaked and groaned beneath him, then lifted him up into the blinding sunlight and the thunderous roar of the Colosseum crowd. The arena looked different in the late afternoon light, the shadows of the massive structure creating patterns across the sand as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The crowd was at its most enthusiastic after a full day of spectacle, warmed by wine and excitement, eager for the culminating contests that would conclude the historic games. From the opposite side of the arena, Maximus made his entrance, a powerfully built man whose dark skin gleamed with oil beneath the minimal armor of the Hoplomachus. His helmet was adorned with a horsehair crest that added to his already imposing height, and he carried his weapons with the casual confidence of someone intimately familiar with their use. He acknowledged the crowd's greeting with a raised spear, his movement suggesting leashed power rather than theatrical display. The announcer's introduction emphasized both men's accomplishments. Lucius's defeat of the previously undefeated Tiberian, Maximus's string of 17 victories without ever granting or receiving mercy. The crowd responded enthusiastically to each dramatic detail, clearly anticipating a contest worthy of the day's significance. As they approached the center for the referee's instructions, Lucius studied his opponent carefully. Maximus carried himself differently from Tiberian, less rigid discipline, more fluid awareness. His eyes within his helmet revealed nothing but focused intensity, a predator's gaze assessing its prey. The referee completed his formal duties and stepped back, signaling for the match to begin. Unlike Tiberian, who had launched immediately into aggressive attack, Maximus began with careful circling, spear extended to maintain distance while he evaluated Lucius's movements. This initial caution was unexpected, based on the African's reputation, suggesting a more strategic approach than the wild instinct Balbus had described. Lucius matched this caution, recognizing that the first exchanges would establish the pattern for the entire contest. He maintained his guard, shield positioned to defend against the spear's greater reach, sword ready for opportunistic counters if Maximus overextended. The first attack came suddenly, a lightning-quick thrust of the spear aimed at Lucius's sword arm, followed immediately by a sweeping low strike at his legs when the first attack was blocked. Lucius barely avoided the second thrust, the spear tip grazing his greave as he stepped back. Maximus pressed forward, now fully committed to offensive action, using the spear's reach to keep Lucius at a disadvantage. The weapon was handled with remarkable dexterity, striking from multiple angles with minimal telegraphing of intent. Lucius found himself purely defensive, unable to find an opening for counterattack as he fended off the increasingly aggressive assault. The crowd responded enthusiastically to the skillful exchange, appreciating both Maximus's virtuoso spearwork and Lucius's defensive discipline. But as the contest continued, a pattern began to emerge. Maximus, for all his skill with the spear, was focusing his attacks primarily on Lucius's left side, perhaps targeting the leg that had been wounded in the fight with Tiberian. Recognizing this tendency, Lucius adjusted his strategy. He began to present his left side more openly, inviting attacks while preparing to exploit the predictable pattern. When Maximus committed to a particularly forceful thrust at the seemingly vulnerable target, Lucius was ready. He sidestepped while simultaneously striking the shaft of the spear with his shield, deflecting it downward and momentarily disrupting Maximus's balance. In that brief window of opportunity, Lucius charged forward, inside the effective range of the spear, bringing his gladius to bear against Maximus's more limited, close-range defenses. The African fighter reacted quickly, dropping the spear and drawing his short sword, but not before Lucius's blade opened a cut across his upper arm. First blood drew a roar from the crowd, and the dynamic of the fight shifted dramatically. Now engaged at close quarters, neither fighter held a significant advantage in terms of equipment. The contest became a brutal test of skill, strength, and endurance as they exchanged blows, each seeking the decisive opening that would end the match. Maximus fought with controlled ferocity, his technique less formally perfect than Tiberian's had been, but compensated for by extraordinary speed and unpredictable combinations. Lucius maintained the disciplined, analytical approach that had become his trademark, looking for patterns within the chaos, conserving energy when possible, striking with precision when opportunities presented themselves. Both men accumulated minor wounds as the fight progressed, shallow cuts and bruises that testified to the intensity of the contest without significantly impeding either fighter's capabilities. The crowd's engagement reached fever pitch, the vast amphitheater resonating with their collective response to each dramatic exchange. As the match extended into its later stages, fatigue began to play an increasingly significant role. Both men's movements lost some of their initial crispness, their breathing becoming more labored within the confining helmets, their reactions slightly delayed by muscle exhaustion and accumulated pain. It was in this state of mutual depletion that the critical moment arrived. Maximus, perhaps sensing that his superior endurance gave him an advantage in a prolonged contest, launched a series of powerful attacks designed to overwhelm Lucius's increasingly taxed defenses. One such blow struck Lucius's shield with enough force to numb his arm temporarily, creating a momentary vulnerability that Maximus immediately exploited with a follow-up strike. The African sword slipped past Lucius's compromised guard and bit deeply into his side, finding the gap between pieces of armor. Pain exploded through Lucius's body, and he staggered back, blood flowing freely from what was clearly a serious wound. The crowd roared in anticipation of the contest's conclusion, sensing that the tide had turned decisively in Maximus's favor. Maximus pressed his advantage, forcing Lucius into a purely defensive posture as he struggled to compensate for his injury. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body. Each block required increasingly desperate effort. For the first time since his earliest days in the arena, Lucius felt death as an immediate, palpable possibility rather than an abstract risk. In that moment of clarity, facing his own mortality directly, Lucius thought not of his sister's plea to survive, nor of his promise to Flavia to return, but of something Cassius had said during their training. The most dangerous opponent is the one with nothing left to lose. With that thought crystallizing in his mind, Lucius made a decision born of desperation, but executed with calculated precision. Rather than continuing his increasingly ineffective defense, he launched himself forward in a move that seemed like either madness or surrender, directly into Maximus's next attack. The African sword struck Lucius's shoulder, opening another wound. But the unexpected aggression disrupted Maximus's rhythm and brought the fighters into such close proximity that their armor clashed together. Before Maximus could recover from his surprise, Lucius had dropped his shield entirely and grasped his opponent's sword arm with his now free hand, immobilizing it momentarily while driving his own gladius upward into the gap beneath Maximus's arm. The blade found its mark, penetrating deeply into a vital area unprotected by armor. Maximus's body stiffened, his eyes widening behind his helmet's visor as the fatal wound registered. For a moment, they stood locked together, both bleeding, both at the limits of endurance, separated from death only by the finest of margins. Then Maximus's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the sand, his sword falling from suddenly lifeless fingers. Lucius staggered back, barely remaining upright, his own injuries threatening to overwhelm him as the adrenaline of combat began to recede. The crowd's reaction was thunderous, a combination of disbelief, appreciation, and the peculiar bloodlust satisfied by witnessing life and death in its most dramatic form. The referee approached cautiously, confirming what was already evident. Maximus was dead or dying beyond any possibility of intervention. Lucius stood swaying slightly in the center of the arena, blood pooling at his feet from his multiple wounds, his vision beginning to blur at the edges. The referee raised his arm in the formal gesture of victory, and the crowd's response reached new heights of enthusiasm. In the imperial box, the emperor himself stood to acknowledge the exceptional contest, a rare honor that registered dimly through Lucius's pain-fogged consciousness. As attendants rushed forward to assist him from the arena, Lucius's last coherent thought before darkness claimed him was a simple affirmation: "I'm still alive. I kept my promise." The journey back from the edge of death was neither quick nor certain. Lucius's wounds were severe enough that for several days his survival remained in question. He drifted in and out of consciousness, aware sometimes of urgent voices around him, of hands tending his injuries, of pain that ebbed and flowed like tides at the shore of his awareness. When he finally emerged fully into consciousness, he found himself in unfamiliar surroundings. Not the Ludus's infirmary, but a private room with amenities suggesting considerable expense. Flavia sat beside his bed, her face showing the strain of prolonged worry beneath the relief of seeing him awake and aware. "Where?" His voice emerged as a croak, his throat dry from disuse. Flavia quickly offered him water, supporting his head as he drank. "You're in the physician Claudius's private clinic," she explained. "Balbus arranged it after the fight. The best care in Rome, regardless of cost." "How long?" Lucius asked, noting the healing progress of his wounds. 8 days. Her hand found his, squeezing gently. The sword struck dangerously close to vital organs. There was concern about infection, but the worst has passed now. As his mind cleared further, memories of the fight with Maximus returned. The desperate final exchange, the knowledge that he had killed yet another opponent, the roar of the crowd as he stood victorious despite his injuries. But there were gaps after that point, moments lost to pain and blood loss. "What happened after?" he asked. "After the fight," Flavia's expression brightened slightly, "your victory over Maximus has made you famous throughout Rome. The emperor himself commended your skill and courage. Balbus has received offers for your appearance in games across the empire, though he's deferred all decisions until your recovery is complete. And you? How are you here rather than at the Ludus? Balbus assigned me to assist with your care. Claudius is an excellent physician, but he agreed that having someone familiar with your previous treatments would be beneficial." A small smile touched her lips. "I've barely left this room in 8 days." The dedication suggested by this simple statement moved Lucius deeply. "Thank you," he said softly, the words inadequate to express his gratitude for her presence during his vulnerability. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the physician himself, Claudius, a distinguished-looking Greek freedman whose reputation among Rome's elite had made him one of the city's most sought-after medical practitioners. He examined Lucius's wounds with professional thoroughness, pleased but not surprised by the progress of healing. "Your recovery has been remarkable considering the severity of your injuries," he commented as he replaced the bandages. "Another few days of rest, and you can begin limited movement. Full recovery will take longer, of course. Several weeks before you could consider training again, and at least 2 months before another fight would be advisable." After the physician departed, promising to send food suitable for Lucius's condition, a more unexpected visitor arrived, Caius Balbus himself. The lanista entered with uncharacteristic solemnity, studying his prized fighter with an expression that combined professional assessment with something almost like concern. "You've cost me considerable coin in medical expenses," he said by way of greeting, though the complaint lacked its usual edge. "Fortunately, your victory has more than compensated for the investment." "I'm pleased to have maintained my value," Lucius replied dryly, the familiar dynamic of owner and asset reasserting itself despite the unusual circumstances. Balbus smiled thinly, acknowledging the subtle resistance in the response. "Your value has increased exponentially. The defeat of Maximus, coming so soon after Tiberian, has made you one of the most sought-after fighters in the empire." He pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat, an unexpectedly familiar gesture from a man who typically maintained clear hierarchical distance. "I've come to discuss your future," he continued, his tone shifting to one of business. "The offers for your next appearance are substantial, enough that a single fight could generate more revenue than most gladiators produce in their entire careers. But such a fight would carry corresponding risks," Lucius observed. "Precisely. Which leads me to a proposition." Balbus leaned forward slightly. "Before your match with Maximus, I mentioned the possibility of manumission within a year or 2. Recent developments have accelerated that timeline." Lucius felt a surge of alertness despite his weakened condition. "How so?" "I've received an offer from the Emperor himself. He was impressed by your performances and wishes to add you to the Imperial Gladiatorial School, a rare honor that comes with substantial compensation to your current owner." Balbus's expression revealed his satisfaction with this development. "Should I accept, your path would diverge significantly from what we previously discussed." "In what way?" "The Imperial School offers different terms. You would no longer be a slave, but an auctoratus, A free man contracted to fight for a specified period, typically 3 to 5 years. The pay is generous, the training exceptional, and upon completion of your contract, you would be a wealthy man, free to pursue whatever future you desire. The proposition was unexpected and required careful consideration. Freedom, albeit with conditions, much sooner than anticipated. The opportunity to accumulate substantial wealth, rather than simply earning basic liberation, but also a binding commitment to years of continued fighting at the highest and most dangerous levels. "And if I prefer our original arrangement?" Lucius asked, wanting to understand all options before responding. Balbus shrugged slightly. "Then we proceed as discussed. A few more high-profile fights under my management, and I grant your manumission, likely within a year given your current trajectory. You would be free, but without significant resources, requiring some form of livelihood." The distinction was clear. Immediate conditional freedom with eventual wealth versus slightly delayed complete freedom with limited means. Both paths had merit. Both contained risks and opportunities. "I need time to consider," Lucius said finally. "Of course. The Emperor doesn't expect an immediate response, and your recovery takes precedence in any case." Balbus rose to leave, then hesitated. "One more thing. Should you choose the Imperial offer, you would be permitted an entourage, assistants, trainers, personal physicians. Such positions often serve as pathways to freedom for those currently enslaved." The implication was clear, and Lucius knew it was deliberately offered. A potential solution to the unspoken concern about Flavia's status. If he joined the Imperial School, he could potentially arrange for her to accompany him as part of his support staff, eventually securing her freedom through that association. After Balbus departed, Lucius shared the conversation with Flavia, who had tactfully withdrawn during the Lannister's visit, but returned immediately afterward. Her reaction was measured, considering implications rather than responding emotionally to the unexpected possibilities. "The Imperial School is prestigious," she observed, "and the Octoratus status would mean immediate legal freedom, even with the contractual obligation to continue fighting. But it would also mean more fights against the most dangerous opponents in the Empire," Lucius countered. "The risk of death would be substantially higher than following our original plan." They discussed the alternatives at length, weighing options, considering contingencies. The conversation continued intermittently over the following days as Lucius's strength gradually returned. Claudius confirmed his continued progress, allowing him to begin limited movement around the room, rebuilding muscles weakened by injury and inactivity. Throughout this recovery period, Lucius found himself reflecting not just on the immediate decision before him, but on the broader journey that had brought him to this point. From captive to slave to gladiator to celebrated fighter, transformations partly imposed, partly chosen, each containing elements of both constraint and possibility. The final decision crystallized not from logical analysis, but from a deeper recognition of what truly mattered. On the 10th day of his recovery, as he stood by the window of his room, looking out at the Roman streets below, he turned to Flavia with newfound clarity. "I've decided," he said simply. "I'll accept the imperial offer." And she studied his face, seeking the reasoning behind the choice. "Because of the wealth it promises." "No." He moved to stand before her, taking both her hands in his, a gesture now made without hesitation or fear of observation. "Because it offers the surest path to freedom for both of us, together." The word hung between them, laden with all the meaning they had carefully avoided expressing directly during their months of cautious connection. Together, not just as two people pursuing parallel paths to liberation, but as partners in whatever future awaited beyond the constraints of their current existence. "Are you certain?" Flavia asked, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "The risks are considerable." "Life is risk," Lucius replied, "in the arena or beyond it. But having something, someone, worth fighting for makes those risks meaningful rather than merely imposed. Her fingers tightened around his, acknowledgement and acceptance in the simple pressure. Then we go forward, together. The decision made, events moved with surprising speed. Balbus, informed of Lucius's choice, initiated the necessary arrangements with evident satisfaction at the profitable conclusion to his investment. Formal documents were prepared, imperial representatives consulted, transition plans developed for when Lucius's recovery was complete. Flavia was officially designated as his personal healer, the first member of what would become his entourage at the Imperial School. The position came with improved status, separate quarters, and the implicit understanding that her path to freedom was now linked directly to his success, rather than dependent on Balbus's uncertain generosity. As Lucius's strength returned more fully, he began light training exercises under Claudius's supervision, rebuilding his body in preparation for the rigorous regimen that awaited him. The physician was impressed by his determination and rapid progress, attributing it to both physical resilience and mental discipline. "You have the constitution of a man who has decided to live regardless of circumstances," Claudius observed during one session. "It's a quality I've seen rarely, even among the most celebrated fighters." "I made promises," Lucius replied simply, "to my sister, to myself, and to others. Living is the only way to keep them." The day finally came when Claudius declared him sufficiently recovered to leave the clinic and begin the transition to his new status. A formal ceremony would be held at the Imperial Palace, where he would sign the contract that would transform him from slave to octoratus, from property to contracted professional. On the morning of this significant day, as he prepared to leave the room that had been his world during recovery, Lucius found a moment of quiet reflection with Flavia. Both were acutely aware of the threshold they were crossing, not just physically leaving the clinic, but stepping into a fundamentally altered future. "Are you afraid?" she asked, helping him don the formal tunic provided for the ceremony, far finer clothing than he had ever worn before. "Not of what lies ahead," he answered truthfully, "only of failing to make the most of this opportunity we've been given." Flavia smoothed the fabric across his shoulders, her touch lingering in a brief caress. "You won't fail, not after coming so far." She stepped back to assess his appearance, her expression softening. "The farmer's son from Gaul has traveled a long road, and has further yet to go," Lucius added, offering his hand to her. "But not alone anymore." She took his hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that symbolized everything they had become to each other, and everything they hoped to be. In that moment, despite the uncertainties that still lay ahead, Lucius felt a sense of rightness, as though all the suffering and struggle had been leading not just to survival, but to this specific future, this particular possibility. "Together then," Flavia said softly, echoing their earlier agreement. "Whatever comes next." "Together," Lucius confirmed, the word no longer just a hope, but a commitment. With that, they left the room and stepped into the Roman sunlight, moving not as slave and healer, but as partners facing an uncertain future with shared purpose and the hard-earned knowledge that survival alone was not enough. Life, real life, required something more. The courage to build meaning even within constraints, to forge connections despite vulnerability, to risk loss in pursuit of genuine gain. For Lucius, who had entered the arena as a man fighting merely to keep a promise to survive, this evolution represented the most significant victory of all, not over an opponent, but over the limited vision of existence that circumstances had attempted to impose. Whatever challenges awaited in the Imperial School, whatever fights remained to be won or lost, he would face them not just as Lucius the Gladiator, but as a man who had reclaimed the essential freedom to choose his own meaning. As they made their way through the streets of Rome toward the Imperial Palace, Lucius reflected that perhaps this was the true lesson of a gladiator's worst day, not merely how to survive it, but how to emerge from it with something worth surviving for. In his case, that something had taken the form of a shared future with the woman beside him, but the principle transcended their specific story. Freedom, connection, purpose, these were the treasures worth fighting for, worth risking everything to achieve. The worst day might reveal the depths of vulnerability and constraint, but it also offered the opportunity to discover what truly mattered beyond mere continued existence. Lucius had made that discovery, had transformed his worst day into the foundation for his best possible future. And in doing so, he had answered the question that had haunted him since his first fight. What was worth living for? Not just survival, not just freedom, but the chance to choose one's own path and to walk it alongside those who made the journey meaningful.